Hi, I'm Portable Orange. You can call me Port. A few months ago, I came across this video by this guy, Leather Apron, that was talking about Roman history, and specifically how gay they were. I love stuff like this. I love analysis of these really specific niche parts of history that often might be misconstrued or have some common misconceptions around it. Now, my own preconceptions before I watched this were essentially that Romans didn't have our modern concept of gay and straight, and men were pretty much free to engage with men and women as they pleased, providing that the bottoming male partner was of a lower social class than the top. Now, this is just what I thought before I really got into this stuff. As you'll see, my views actually ended up changing fairly dramatically. But not because of Leather. He was making some fairly radical claims like,
homosexuality as it exists today simply was not very prevalent in ancient Rome, and it certainly was never approved of in any of its forms. When the Romans could be bothered to even comment on it, it was always negative. Adult male-on-male relationships were always hated.
What I really appreciated, though, was he included a document which had a ton of quotes to back up the claims he was making. Now, from my own experience trying to discern anything from academic articles, I've learned a golden rule: always follow the footnotes. Leather certainly didn't make this easy because he included a lot of these weird abbreviations that, before I started looking into this, I really was not familiar with at all. It took a fair bit of work to track down things like in cat. It's not really the easiest thing to Google. But when I was able to track these quotes down, I realized that most of the time they didn't really say what Leather claimed, or they were framed in horribly bad faith. At one point, I got to one of his citations and realized he had completely made up the quote, straight up adding words to change the meaning. When I Googled it, however, I found Leather wasn't the first person to add these words into the quote. There actually was a scholar who had done the same thing, a scholar whom Leather himself cites throughout the course of his video. What strikes me as so disingenuous is he'll often say,
and at least in my research, these quotes are more numerous and they come from men who, perhaps unsurprisingly, history has remembered more fondly.
Which to me makes it sound like he's read all these quotes and found them himself. However, what I'll show through the course of my video is he hasn't even read most of the sources he's citing. He's mostly read a couple specific scholars and then presented sometimes their work and sometimes the opposite of their work as if it was his own. In fact, for the majority of quotes in this document, he gets them completely wrong, either misquoting them or completely missing the context, or in several instances quoting something that I can't find in the actual work that he's citing. Now, in general, I don't really have an issue of starting with Wikipedia or websites or scholarly articles to kind of start your research. In fact, this is mostly how I did a lot of this research. I'd go online, Google something, find a website or a JSTOR article or even a Wikipedia page. But then, whenever they'd make a claim with a citation, I'd track down that citation and see if I agreed with the underlying point they were making. The issue I have with what Leather did was he didn't then track down any of their citations to confirm that what they were saying was backed up by the underlying material. This struck me as really disingenuous and frankly kind of annoyed me, so I decided to make this video. Welcome to my channel, by the way. Subscribe, or don't. This is my first video, and honestly, I kind of don't know if I'm going to do another one. These take a really long time to make. I started this in like November, and it's like March now, hopefully, by the time I get this out. Though a lot of the framing of this video is going to be on disproving Leather's claims, I'm hoping through both things I'm going to present myself and disproving Leather's claims that I can present some semblance of history surrounding homosexuality in the Roman Empire. And I figure I'll do one better than Leather. When I'm talking about something, I'll usually throw up a quote behind me like this, but it might be a little too fast for you to catch. So I'll also put a number on screen, which if you go to the companion document, which I have linked in my video description, will have a link to the source I'm talking about, as well as telling you where in the source is my quote, so you can read all the context you'd like to around it. There are a handful of times that my source isn't online for whatever reason. So for those, I'll just have a screenshot with an apology and a bit of an explanation in the companion doc. I'll also, to the best of my ability, try to point out where Leather is getting all of his quotes and analyses from, whether it be a scholar or a random website or even Wikipedia. I'm also going to butcher the pronunciation of a lot of names, so apologies to any actual historians who come across this video. And in doing my own research, I actually really ended up changing a lot of my ideas on this topic. If anything, I got quite a bit more radical, though in the opposite direction of leather.
Also, if you notice my hair change, I kept doing more research as I was editing and had to do like 6 reshoots.
So without further ado, let's take a look at how gay the ancient Romans really were. Leather begins by narrowing the scope of the conversation into 3 main categories: time period, the location, the city of Rome itself, and class.
Another problem with the debate is that it focuses on a narrow scope of Roman history and pretends that it represents the whole. The period that pro-gay scholars tend to focus on runs from 200 BC to 200 AD.
For this, he cites Roman Homosexuality by Craig A. Williams, which is a piece we'll be coming back to a lot. He doesn't give a specific quote from the piece, and all I can find is that stuprum laws were in effect from 200 BC to 200 AD. Side note, stuprum you could basically think of as a crime of a sexual nature, but it's not necessarily gay. And in addition, Williams does actually make the argument that there was homosexuality much earlier than this time period. Leather's main claim for his 200 AD end date comes from 3 main points.
As early as the start of his reign in 138 AD, Antoninus Pius, the successor to Hadrian,
who was a famously gay emperor that we will get to later,
was strongly opposed to homosexual behavior. His successor and adoptive son, Marcus Aurelius, seemed to condemn all such activity too.
He also mentions
in the 240s AD, homosexual prostitution was made illegal, while heterosexual prostitution remained conspicuously untouched.
By Emperor Philip the Arab in about 250 AD, as well as
in 390 AD, a law was added which sentenced homosexuals to public execution by fire.
Note these are about 100 and 200 years after the death of Hadrian, so is he right about this later bookend? No. All of this Leather got almost entirely from Roman Attitudes to Greek Love, a piece by Ramsay MacMullen, which essentially makes the argument that Romans didn't really like homosexuality and that it was kind of seen as like a foreign custom imported from Greece. I really don't like this piece because, as we'll get to, there are several times he will straight up lie and straight up make up quotes. Now, I'll leave Marcus Aurelius for later. We're going to cover him with the rest of the emperors because there is some really interesting evidence that he might have had homosexual experiences, especially with his tutor. But for Pius, however, I have done a ton of research and I cannot figure out what they're talking about at all. The best I could find was one guy on Reddit saying he cracked down on the practice of having like a favorite young boy male slave. But I couldn't find anything to back up what that guy on Reddit was saying, and he didn't quote anything either. But what I do know is Pius did pass a lot of legislation to protect slaves. And one of those pieces of legislation did ban the unjust torture of slaves under the age of 14.
There is one record in the digest of Pius punishing a man for having relations with a boy, but it's clear this was a case of force and kidnapping. As we'll get to in a moment, Leather often takes laws cracking down on sexual assault and assumes they applied to consensual relationships.
But either way, he was adopted by Hadrian, who was a very gay emperor, and gave Hadrian all his due honors upon his death. So if he did have a problem with homosexuals, he certainly didn't seem to have a problem sucking up to them. He also mentions legislation against male prostitution. Philip the Arab did not successfully ban male prostitution. The only evidence we have of his attempt comes from the historian Aurelian Victor in his work De Caesaribus, where he says that, nevertheless, it still survives. And indeed, male prostitution remains sanctioned and taxed for over a century after this. And he was writing about 100 years after Philip would have been passing this in 361 AD. And just to be clear, male prostitution was still going on in the city of Rome itself in the year 390 AD, when Emperor Theodosian passed a law that male prostitutes were to be publicly executed. And indeed, they were pulled from their brothels and quite brutally publicly executed on the streets of Rome. It would have been pretty difficult to publicly execute them if they weren't both there and openly practicing. So again, the end date for when Rome stopped being gay seems to be a little too soon. We can probably trace it to at least 350. So maybe later Romans were more gay than we thought, but how far back in history does it go? Leather has 2 examples to cement his 200 BC date. The first comes from Livy, a historian writing in the 1st century BC, and the second from the historian Valerius Maximus, writing in the 1st century AD. Very quickly, this is all from MacMullen again. Livy's story, according to Leather, is
male sexual assault, even of slaves, was punished.
This is not at all what the story is about. The citation he gives is Livy 828, which is part of Livy's very big historical work from the founding of the city. And in it, a Roman male citizen has become in debt to a creditor. So the rich guy basically does like the cheesy like adult video line where he says like, oh, well, if you can't pay me with money, maybe you could pay me with your body. And then the young boy is like, no, I don't want to do that. And the old guy basically has him chained up and like whipped. The boy manages to get away and runs out into the street, and everyone sees him all like bloody and beaten. And he basically explains the story, and everyone very rightfully gets like furious at this dude. And so they charge into the Senate, and the Senate then passes a law that specifically says creditors can make use of their debtors' works and property, but importantly, not their bodies. This isn't really about the sexual abuse of slaves, like Leather puts it, but more importantly, it's not quite a gay thing. It's kind of more about consent, because the guy is pretty clearly assaulting the boy who keeps saying no. So this isn't like a consensual gay relationship that's being frowned upon. Leather's second quote from Valerius is a similar story.
And this is corroborated by Valerius Maximus, who wrote that pudicitia, that is Roman chastity, was defended by law.
That's not what he says. Also, this is a part we've already gone over.
Valerius Maximus later suggests that voluntarily engaging in homosexual acts was condemned in early Republican times.
Again, not true. This passage is about a man forcing himself on an unwilling boy and trying to avoid punishment after the fact. The end result of the story is this man is punished for his crimes. However, again, it's pretty clear that he's assaulting this boy. It's not a consensual sexual relationship. Neither of these instances tell us what Romans thought about consensual homosexual relationships. So, do we have any evidence of what they thought about that? Yes. Firstly, we have the plays of Plautus, a Roman playwright writing in roughly 245 BC. Many of his plays actually do feature male-male love affairs, and they're usually played positively, implying that it was both common at the time and that it wouldn't be strange to show it being accepted in front of a Roman audience. Some of his most overt examples exist in Casuarina, which Leather himself references, so we'll get to that later. That's in 245, which is really only a little earlier than Leather's start date, but we can actually look even earlier than that with archaeological evidence. Let's go all the way back to 500 BC and look at the Tomb of the Diver, an archaeological site of a funeral ground in mid to southern Italy. In it, you can find this fresco of an older man and a younger boy reclining together, surrounded by other frescoes, some involving other male-male pairings. You could argue this was technically in Magna Graecia, which was essentially the Greek-controlled portion of southern Italy around this time, and therefore this might not really be indicative of what Romans were thinking at the time. However, we have archaeological evidence from other parts of Italy as well, like the Etruscans. Rome actually had a lot of ties to the Etruscans, and some scholars even believe that Rome was originally an Etruscan colony. And if you take a look at the map of their area of control, you can kind of see why. Romans, however, did believe that they were founded by the Alban people, a people who lived in the mountains of Italy just a little further inland. Most scholars don't support the Alban theory, as we don't really have any archaeological evidence that the Albans had any great power in the area at the time. However, a lot of scholars also push back against the Etruscan theory, as the Romans spoke Latin, not the Etruscan language. However, the Romans really looked up to the Etruscans. In fact, the last 3 kings of Rome were all Etruscan, including, confusingly, one who waged war on the Etruscans. But anyway, point is, Etruscans were gay. We have this fresco depicting 2 men having a nice hug, and even ancient Greek historians seem to think as much, with Theopompus saying, and the objects of their love are usually women. Much more, however, do they enjoy consorting with boys and striplings, or younger boys. And earlier, when they've stopped drinking, the servants introduce sometimes courtesans and sometimes beautiful boys, going on to say that they enjoy them and then start to get real freaky. So it seems like both ends of this spectrum are off. There was homosexuality around and in Rome from as early as 600 BC to as late as 390 AD. That's nearly 1,000 years. And Rome, the western half anyway, only lasted about 1,200 years. So that's 83% of Roman history that was gay. That's a solid B. As to where Leather gets the 200 BC to 200 AD dates as being the commonly accepted time period for the Romans to be okay with homosexuality, I can't really find that in a lot of my research. Aside from the Williams bit we already went over, McMullen also seems to say that after the death of Hadrian, the empire kind of stopped being gay. Regardless, Leather copied almost all of this from McMullen. Also, when Leather talks about the Theodosian Code, note his framing when he says,
A law was added which sentenced homosexuals to public execution by fire.
But as we'll see in a little bit, acting the part of the woman was kind of code for being the bottom in a homosexual encounter, implying tops were not censured by this law. Yet Leather uses the word
Homosexuals
to imply that it was a general censure. And pay attention to this because he will do this a lot, where things only referring to the bottom partner he will imply as referring to the totality.
Leather's next point of constriction is
The pro-gay side tends only to discuss the opinions of those people from the city of Rome itself. The focus on people from the city comes partly out of necessity. Most of our surviving documents were written by the city elite for the city elite.
I super disagree with this. We have a ton of writings from Egypt and Greece and even Britain. After the western half of the empire fell, the eastern half still continued for another 1,000 years, and they kept a lot of records, but it's kind of irrelevant to the video, so I'm going to put a lot of my thoughts for that in the companion doc. Leather does try and give us an idea of what people outside the city of Rome might have thought about homosexuality by referencing
One law passed by Julius Caesar protected citizens from being forced to sit next to known homosexuals at public events, and this was specifically for use in Italian towns outside of Rome.
I appreciate that Leather directly cited McMullen here, because when I show how wrong McMullen was, Leather's at least a little bit shielded from that.
McMullen, making the same claim, cites the Tabula Heraclenesis. Tabula Heraclensis, I think is how you say that. Herculean tablet. The specific part being referenced outlawed certain types of people from standing for office, serving as a lawyer, or voting. A later portion of the law says people in this category also cannot sit in seating sections reserved for town leaders. They can sit next to anyone else, and even the town leaders, as long as they're not within the specified seats. But let's examine exactly who is affected here. In fact, there are a ton of people banned from this, including thieves, fraudsters, convicted criminals, gladiators, debtors who can't pay, people who have property seized by the courts, exiles, people who make false accusations, dishonorably discharged soldiers, anyone who commits treason, anyone who trains gladiators, actors, not all
And, the point in question, those who have made profit from their bodies, or prostitutes.
Note, in that long list, there is nothing about anyone being gay.
McMullen himself even quotes the Latin correctly, so I feel he's being dishonest here.
He also mentions a quote by Minucius Felix,
Uses the term urbanitas to refer to people who were tolerant of homosexuality, indicating that this practice was perceived to be more prevalent in the cities among the urbanites.
Note Leather only quotes one word here. We'll get to why in a second.
However, what Leather doesn't mention is that Felix was a Christian writer. He was a Christian apologist, and this is actually from a piece called Octavian, written in the 1st century AD, that was essentially arguing for why Christianity was better than the Roman pagan state religion. In the 1st century AD, Christianity was heavily suppressed in the Roman Empire. Christians were hated as essentially uncooperative fire starters because they just wouldn't sacrifice to Jupiter.
In addition, this section is not even making any claims about urbanites versus rural village dwellers. This specific section is talking about how the Egyptian Romans impute crimes towards the Christians that they themselves are guilty of, at least according to Felix. Leather likely missed all of this context because McMullen only quoted the word urbanitas, meaning that was all Leather had to go on because he couldn't be bothered to just look up the source and see what it was saying. Note that though McMullen is making similar claims, it's clear in this context the word urbanitas is meant to mean manners or civility, which was indeed one of the definitions of this word. Unless the claim is Felix is saying, these Egyptians, among whom an iota of indecency is called city-like.
His last caveat before we get into the meat of the discussion is
The Romans actually wrote very little about sexuality at all, and references specific to homosexuality are even more rare.
we both have filled incredibly long videos with those writings. So I'm just going to say that kind of disproves it. And for now, just take my word that they wrote a lot about sex. Leather then goes on to caveat,
Many of the historical sources we have which attest to some form of homosexual behavior are simply accusations, almost always political and always meant to be negative.
I also want to take this opportunity to dive into Leather's citation document, because in case you're under the impression that he was just being lazy and not malicious, let me fix that. This quote, as Leather so kindly points out, is from Amy Richland's Not Before Homosexuality, a piece which again we'll be returning to a lot. The quote he gave has this weird ellipses, and Leather claims at the end that this is clearly indicating that Richland's agreeing with him. However, in the full context, take for example one group of men who like to be sexually penetrated by other men. A historian might doubt their very existence, tested as it is only by hostile sources. Alternatively, as I will do here, it might be argued that there was such a group of men. Along with women to whom they were likened, they participated in silence. So even Leather knows he's full of it here, because he obviously copied that directly from her work. To really nail him, that section starts with Richland, an avowed feminist, saying, "It is a commonplace of women's history that writing has belonged to men." So her earlier quote isn't even saying these men were always viewed negatively, only that their history was never published, something that she is trying to fix through her work. But Port, I hear you ask, isn't he more just making the point that the only evidence we have of these men comes from hostile sources? Isn't he just trying to imply that they clearly were seen negatively given the sources we have on them? And I'm glad you brought that up, straw man that I invented, because I can't think of a better transition. Because Leather's next point is,
the instances of male-on-male relationships that did occur in ancient Rome were almost always between a Roman citizen and his slave, or a Roman citizen and a non-citizen boy. Any other form of homosexuality was universally condemned by all at all times.
He even goes so far as to pose a challenge. Find any examples of depictions of adult male-male relationships. And sure, there's Nisus and Euryalus from the Aeneid, the founding story of Rome that was written in the 1st century BC. And the author of that poem, the poet Virgil, specifically put in there that their loving hearts were one. For explicitly sex, why not the frescoes of the baths of Pompeii, or the Spintria, which, depending on who you trust, was either used for gambling or tokens at brothels. For real life, why not Emperor Domitian and his eunuch Erinus? Domitian even had poetry commissioned for Erinus.
Martial, a poet writing under Domitian in the 1st century AD, wrote several of them, and in one even compares him to Ganymede, Jupiter's cupbearer, who Jupiter also had a sexual relationship with. Speaking of poetry, I also want to mention the poet Catullus. Catullus lived during the 1st century BC, and he wrote a number of poems, including my favorite 16, in which he threatens to sexually assault 2 other members of the Senate because they called him soft. For a relationship between adults, though, I want to look at who he calls Juventius. Now, importantly, we don't know exactly who Juventius was, but we do know he was male. And interestingly, the name Juventius comes from the Latin word juventa, which means youth. But youth is not quite the same way we would think of it. Under the 6th king of Rome, Servius Tullius, men were split into 3 age groups: those that were too young to serve in the army, those who could serve in the army, and those who were too old to serve in the army. Juventa, or the age group that could serve in the army, started at age 17, or the traditional age that Romans would start wearing the toga, and lasted until 46. This record survives to us in a quote attributed to Quintus Aelius Tubero, who would have been a little older than Catullus, but living around the same time. So this youth would have been at least 17 years old. Catullus was writing for the sadly unrequited love he had for an adult male who was in relationships with other adult men. There's even some interesting evidence this boy may have been of noble birth. Catullus refers to him in one of his poems as the flower of the Juventae, and the Juventae were a noble family from the same area of Italy as Catullus.
Can there be no one in all these people, Juventutis? No nice man you might begin to like, besides that guest of yours, yellower than a gilded statue, from the environs of deadly Pissarro, who pleases you now, and whom you dare prefer to me, and do who knows what with? Now, this implies that the youth actually has a choice in who his lover is, which, as we know from a slave, certainly would not have been the case, and even from a boy, probably wouldn't have been the case. This poem even indicates he's hosting his lover, in that he owns property, or possibly is renting an apartment, but at the very least is not a slave or a boy who wouldn't be able to afford his own property.
To keep ages in mind at this time, Catullus, from what the later poet Ovid wrote, tragically died quite young, around 30. So he would have been a Juventa himself.
And just for one more piece of evidence on Catullus, his poem 50 is actually about him lusting after a male friend that he had spent the previous day drinking and writing poetry with. So, challenge complete. Now, when I began this project, my initial sort of argument was going to be that Leather was narrowing the concept of what gay was to an insane degree by claiming that
whatever went on in ancient Rome at this time, absolutely should not be conflated with modern homosexuality.
He never defines modern homosexuality, but I believe what he's referring to is a loving relationship between two men of roughly equal status, or at least equal status within the relationship. Now, let's even ignore the examples I just listed and assume that Leather's actually correct there. He then goes on to say,
The Roman homosexuals that did exist and modern gays have almost nothing in common.
I can think of one thing. Two dudes. That feels pretty gay to me. Like, yes, our modern conception of homosexuality didn't exist back in ancient Rome. A lot of our modern concepts didn't. In fact, the modern concept of marriage that we practice today would have been incredibly foreign to the Romans. But they didn't even have a word in Latin for gay or straight. Most of their words just centered around the roles taken during the act, whether you played the top or active role or the bottom or passive role. My favorite is Pathic to describe the bottom or passive role, and that's what I'm going to be using from here on out. Saying just because they didn't use the words, they would have had no concept of it is just obtuse. Words have meaning, sure, but a lot of times that meaning is an underlying concept that's shared. I can't think of his name, but that Republican politician like a few years back, well, for me a few years back, probably like 20 years back now, who was trying to hook up with guys in like airport bathrooms and got caught by the cops. Did anyone read that headline and go like, well, I mean, he wasn't trying to marry him, so at least this isn't gay. Yes, there were different conceptions, but that's not to say the two
have almost nothing in common.
And now, finally, Leather states his two main arguments for this video.
I will therefore be arguing against this idea that homosexuality was accepted or commonplace at any point in ancient Rome. These are the two criteria to which I will constantly be referring back: how commonplace it was and how accepted it was.
We'll see how correct these are. Leather then goes over the concept of virtus, or Roman masculinity. Overall, it's not like super relevant to our conversation, so I'm just going to put most of my thoughts to this in the companion doc, but there was one thing I wanted to touch on here really quickly. Leather claims
to not be sexually conservative was to violate the Roman imperative of maintaining virtus,
and cites two very famous senators and orators: Cato from the mid-Republic, like 3rd to 2nd century BC, and Cicero from the 1st century BC.
Take the case where Marcus Porcius Cato expelled one Manilius from the Senate because he had kissed his wife in broad daylight in front of his children.
Leather paints this as Cato being so sexually conservative that even hugging your wife in public was bad. However, the very next part of the story is Cato telling other senators that he only embraced his wife when it thundered, and he enjoyed it when it thundered loudly. The larger issue here is male and female roles. Cato, a staunch conservative at the time, believed that men should not show affection in public because that could be perceived as weak. However, as the next part goes, he's all for bragging about sex. In addition, Plutarch tells a story where Cato is sleeping with his concubine, a slave girl, and his son gives him a disapproving look, whereupon Cato goes out and marries a woman of much lower social class, presumably to get back at his son, and continues to have relations with both women, not exactly a champion of sexual conservatism. For Cicero, Leather claims he says,
excessive lust for women was considered a disease.
but this is missing all context.
This comes from Cicero's piece, Tuscan Disputations. In this part, he's examining common vices people have and trying to determine if they come from good or evil. In the specific part Leather is referencing, Cicero begins by examining greed or pursuit of money.
Cato is essentially talking about how pursuit of money is not inherently a bad thing. However, this can lead to blinding greed, which he claims is a disease, much like desire for glory and lust for women. However, he goes on to say the opposite of these things, avoiding money, wealth, and fame, are also diseases, but they come from fear. He does overall argue to keep a middle ground, but ends by saying that pursuit of money is not inherently a bad thing, implying pursuit of women and glory also isn't an inherently bad thing as long as you don't allow yourself to be consumed by it.
In addition, in a letter to one of his friends, Cicero once defended a man having both a wife and mistress at the same time, quoting an older Socratic philosopher in doing so. Not exactly sexually conservative.
So where did Leather get this from? The Williams piece this time. I like Williams a little more than McMullen. I mean, first off, his piece is like 10 times as long, but more importantly, I think that he'll get a lot more right than McMullen does. However, in this case, as I just showed, he did fall short. Here, Williams' explanation for the later part I referenced is that Cato was saying that when a thunderclap happened, is when he'd jump into his wife's arms. Like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge of like, oh, I only grab onto my wife when I'm scared of thunder, which kind of seems to fly in the face of like Roman masculinity, like strength and not giving into fear, but then like thunder happens, so I have to grab onto a woman. In addition, why would he frequently tell people that? Like, even if it is a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, it's a little odd to be like, yeah, he just constantly went around telling everyone he was scared of thunder. However, again, as we've seen from the brothels and sex scandals, and even Cicero and Cato either approving of or engaging in extramarital affairs with prostitutes or whatever you want to call them, does seem like, much like today, a certain amount of Roman masculinity did involve sexual conquest.
And now we really get into it with the claim
They absolutely despised sexually passive men.
he begins with the story of a boy who was Pathic being banished by his father. He actually provides two sources, with the second clarifying that he had the son killed with the help of his slaves. However, he ignores the next part. The full quote is from Orosius, a much later Roman historian and actually Christian priest, writing in the 4th, 5th century AD. During those same days, Q. Fabius Maximus sent his youthful son away to his country estate, and there had him put to death by 2 slaves who were accomplices in the murder. He at once manumitted these slaves as a reward for their part in the crime. Upon the accusation of Censor Pompeius, he was tried and found guilty. Roman society, via the legal system, actually condemned the father for his actions and punished him very harshly.
And now I will fully introduce the third of the sources Leather loves to steal from, Amy Richland's Not Before Homosexuality. This is a piece mostly examining the Pathic or bottom men in Roman society and what their lives and history might have been like through the late Republic to kind of mid to late Empire. I'm honestly super torn on if I like Richland or not. She will do some really good work and then turn around and completely miss something that I at least find is very obvious. However, she is cited a lot by a lot of other scholars. I find a ton of other people referencing her, so she's at least well known in the field. Regardless, she also didn't include that extra sentence from Orosius, which is why Leather missed it, because he didn't actually look up the source for himself. However, for Richland's credit, she was more using this to show that the punishment for homosexuality was typically handled within the family. However, as I just showed, even if this was the case, society at large did not agree with the father's actions.
Leather also provides examples of
There are at least 3 instances I found where men or boys who were either threatened with or actually endured buggery opted to commit
self-delete.
These are all from McMullen, and whoo boy, did Leather not check these.
First, a quote from the 1st century AD lawyer/orator Quintilian is wildly misleading. The larger overall passage is about when should you tell the truth in a courtroom. The Roman legal system was a little bit different from our modern one. The full line is, in those where there is no question of guilt, but only of law, we may, even though the facts be against us, admit the truth. He assaulted a freeborn boy, and the latter hanged himself. But that is no reason for the author of the assault to be awarded capital punishment as having caused his death. He will instead pay 10,000 sesterces, the fine imposed by law for such a crime. So this is just a hypothetical. And even then, the guy can just pay a fine. Leather then mentions,
including in the case of the gladiator Sporus,
which even he notes through a note on the screen, isn't correct.
Leather must have filmed this part really early. McMullen, who he stole this from, mentions Sporus briefly at this part, and then much later in the article actually goes on to detail who Sporus was. That being said, you could have just done a Wikipedia search and almost immediately realized Sporus was never a gladiator.
One thought I had after filming, it's possible Leather actually did track this source down, but only went to the specific chapter and line McMullen cited, saw that, quote, it was proposed bit, and assumed he was a gladiator. Hence the mistake.
As to there not being any surviving depictions of Sporus, there actually might be. We kind of don't know. He was said to look like Nero's second wife, and so statues of her might be of him, or might have been repurposed that way, or vice versa.
For now, just know that Sporus was the second husband of Emperor Nero, who looked like his second wife, and never fought in any gladiator games, ever. He didn't self-delete until 3 emperors after Nero. Granted, that was in the year/18 months of the 4 emperors, so it wasn't like we're talking like 30 years later. It was like a year later. But he had been in 2 very public relationships at this time. One was with the leader of the Praetorian Guard under Nero, who, while he tried to take the throne, was never actually able to, and the Emperor Otho, who was able to take the throne.
The specific quote Leather cites is from Dio, but in that quote, Sporus is going to be put to death by Vitellius, one of the emperors in the year of the 4 emperors. The method of execution is going to be a very public reenactment of a story from the early Roman Republic called the R-word of the Sabines. In this, Sporus will play a Sabine woman, and a bunch of men will gang R-word him. Rather than suffer that, Sporus chooses to end things on his own terms.
But we'll get to Sporus a bit later. There's so much I want to talk about with him later.
Also, the Tacitus bit, which Leather doesn't talk about in his video directly, hence why I forgot to film a bit for it, is about a boy being assassinated. No self-deletion or assault. Just one line about maybe the emperor would have assaulted him, so maybe this is better. But again, Leather didn't track down any of his sources, so he didn't realize McMullen was lying here.
Leather then cites a passage from Suetonius, a Roman historian writing in the 1st and 2nd century AD, where in his account of the reign of Emperor Domitian, Leather claims
Emperor Domitian refused to accept donations from a man who was described as a homosexual passive.
I have absolutely no idea what he's talking about here. The specific part Leather references is part of Domitian just after a civil war that he faced during his reign, which he won, in which he's pardoning certain soldiers for participating in that civil war. Those soldiers were Pathics and essentially used that as their excuse, saying that because they were Pathics, they couldn't really have had any influence over the generals. And Domitian seems to buy this and lets them off the hook. There's nothing in here about tribute or Domitian refusing to accept it. Also, as mentioned earlier, Domitian was very fond of Irenaeus, a eunuch.
So I'm pretty sure he got this from Williams, because the way the citation is written is much more similar to the Williams than, say, the McMullen or some of the other pieces we'll get into later. But I don't know how he kind of got this wrong. Williams, to his credit, does say what happened correctly in the document. The citation, the footnote rather, that just has the Latin. So maybe he just took the footnote and translated the Latin with Google Translate and thought tribune was tribute, but I can't find anyone else screwing this up. And again, if he'd read the underlying source, or even the Williams, he would have known what this was referring to.
Leather also talks about Tacitus referencing German executions, in which they would put, according to most English translations, cowards, homosexuals, and adulterers in these wicker cages, and then drown them in the bog.
This is from Richland. And this was also the point where I really started to doubt if Leather had even read the scholars he was claiming he'd read, because Williams also talks about this in a footnote, but he actually leaves a little bit of space for the thing I'm about to say.
Tacitus was very conservative, and he saw Rome as becoming very hedonistic and very sort of like full of self-pleasures and self-aggrandizing, and he was kind of trying to use the barbarians as a foil. And this is indeed what most Roman historians did.
Caesar notably claimed the Britons kept their wives communally, even though we have zero evidence of this.
Now, another interesting note is that this is quite possibly not referencing homosexuality at all. The exact phrase in the Latin is ignavos et imbelles et corpore infames seno ac palude. Now, infames was used for far more than just Pathics. The literal translation would just be, infamous. And the specific phrase et corpore infames would mean those who were infamous with respect to their bodies, which didn't just refer to Pathics. It actually also referred to dishonorably discharged soldiers, prostitutes, even actors.
Livy even uses the same phrase to refer to a man who is deserting his own people in order to defect to the Romans. However, the man thinks to himself that he must bring something of value to the Romans, or he would be seen as worthless and dishonored.
We have another writer from Rome writing 100-ish years around this time, called Sextus Empiricus. And he writes,
among us, sodomy is regarded as shameful, and moreover even illegal, whereas by the Germani they say it is not considered shameful, but just a customary thing.
And even Aristotle, who, though he doesn't call them Germans, he calls them the Celts, and a few others who openly approve of male loves. It is entirely possible that this passage in Tacitus is condemning homosexuality. However, there is a lot of evidence that potentially this isn't what he was referencing. And regardless of whether or not he was referencing it, it's probably not what the Germans were actually doing. Leather also occasionally does this, where he'll just kind of put additional sources and then just put a bunch of stuff. I'm not really going to go through them now. He didn't go through them in his video, but if you really care, you can look at my companion doc where I will link to the sources he referenced and talk about how I believe he's using them incorrectly. Leather goes on to say,
I really cannot stress enough just how far the Roman hatred for sexually passive men extended.
Most of Leather's examples of Pathics being detested do not hold up, and I have provided a bunch, which go ahead and check me if you want to see if those hold up.
Regardless, this was an interesting section for me. Believe it or not, I was actually prepared to agree with Leather on this whole section originally. It was mostly what I had heard before I came into this, that the Pathic or bottom was sort of detested and seen as much, much lower class than, say, the top was. However, as I did more research, I kept finding evidence of Pathics being either politically important, as with Sporus, or publicly celebrated through poetry, as with Aranis, or even seen as heroic, like with Euryalus. And all of that felt at odds with the Pathic detesting society that I had sort of thought was the case, and certainly as Leather still believes was the case. I just don't know how much we can say things like,
and I'm really not even cherry picking here. There just aren't any instances where sexually passive men are considered something that is okay,
when we have these characters very visible in Roman history.
Leather then gets into the theater. However, before he actually gets into any of the arguments, he says,
the theater was not considered a high-class form of entertainment,
and
it had a reputation for attracting people of ill repute, drunks, pimps, prostitutes, and the like.
Which again, no. Senators actually had reserved front row seats that was passed into law under Emperor Augustus, and there were tons of wealthy playwrights, musicians, and even actors, though, as we'll get to in a bit, actors sometimes had a bit of legal trouble. Leather then claims
there were a few different attempts to ban plays altogether in the city, and there were 2 different attempts by Trajan and Tiberius to expel all actors from Rome.
For banning plays, he is completely wrong. The footnote he gives for this, for some reason, is Suetonius' account of the reign of Nero. Nero would never have banned plays. The specific passage he's referencing, again, has nothing to do with the banning of plays.
Nero used to go out as emperor in disguise, get drunk, and then get into fights with people, and even commit other crimes like robbery, generally just kind of being a menace. However, when he once loses one of those fights, he decides he's just going to go to the theater, specifically to watch a very provocative form of theater called pantomime. Now, the actors of pantomime play, and more specifically their fans, had historically been rowdy and caused issues, including a full-scale riot under Tiberius, several emperors before Nero. Nero specifically egged them on until they got so rowdy on a regular basis they had to expel just those actors, not all actors. Tacitus largely agrees with this story, even saying Nero had soldiers take the place of the expelled actors. So plays were not banned. For the expulsion of actors, importantly, neither Tiberius nor Trajan expelled all actors. There were many genres and types of plays being performed in Rome around this time, one of the more famous ones being called Atellan farces. These were comical plays that had initially begun with stock characters, and the lines were almost entirely improvised. Initially, the actors in Atellan farces were not professionals. They were, more often than not, the children of wealthy Romans. Therefore, actors in Atellan farces were not subject to the legal restrictions imposed upon some actors of other genres. These plays were often known to be crude and vulgar, and sometimes the subject matter of the plays would reference a rumor or scandal popular in Rome at the time. Suetonius tells us the story in which Tiberius tries to bed a woman, and when she refuses, he puts her on trial, after which she goes home and ends herself. A group of Atellan farce players then reenacted that at a theater and got a standing ovation. Tiberius was so furious about this, he expelled Atellan farce actors from Italy. Tacitus does mention that Tiberius issued a decree banning actors, but importantly, that decree is specifically referring to Atellan farce actors. Oscan is referencing the fact that the Atellan farce was thought to have originated in Oscan. Tacitus also briefly mentions Tiberius directly interceding to save an actor from condemnation, as this actor had performed in many festivals that Tiberius's mother had had dedicated to Augustus. As a final note for Tiberius, one of his largest public works projects was the restoration of the Theater of Pompeii, the oldest theater in Rome. This continued through his entire reign and wasn't actually finished until the next emperor. If he had expelled all actors, why would he continue to restore this theater? As for Trajan, Leather didn't provide a citation, but I assume he's referencing Trajan's expulsion of the pantomime actors. Very briefly, as this section is already overly long, pantomime came about around the same time as the Atellan farces, but it trended more towards dramas than comedy. Unlike Tiberius, Trajan actually reversed the decision himself in just a few years, and reportedly even had a relationship with a pantomime actor. I know a lot of this must feel like a tangent, but I'm trying to use theater and some plays I'll bring up later to show that everyone from plebeians to senators went and enjoyed these plays. Therefore, it was a very good example of cross-class culture. There's even a history of plays with actors in them being a very important part of Roman religious ceremonies, going back to the early Republic, where many of these plays were commissioned and even funded directly by the Senate. The theater itself was not looked down upon or seen as low class, as Leather puts it. I think a really good modern corollary is television. There are people, of course, who say, oh, TV's rotting people's brains, but everyone watches TV. And there's a wide range of content available, everything from Breaking Bad to Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Oh, I almost forgot. Leather actually took this from the fourth of the works he frequently steals from, even though he never cited this one, called The Politics of Immorality in Ancient Rome by Catherine Edwards. Now, there is a sentence that talks about the banning of plays in there, and there's a citation really close to it that has that part from Nero that he cited. However, again, as Leather never actually looked at the underlying works, what he missed was the footnote doesn't go to the sentence that talks about the banning of plays. It goes to the sentence talking about Nero. The full version of Edwards I was able to access online had a lot of weird formatting issues, hence why I took screenshots from the preview on Google Books. You can see how garbled it is. It's often unclear what footnote goes to what number. It's possible Leather also used this source and got confused by the footnotes, which, to be fair, are somewhat obtuse. But again, he could have just done any research to make sure he was correct. Additionally, Leather claims all
Actors were very likely not allowed to vote. They couldn't be soldiers, and senators and equestrians were barred from associating with them.
These legal censures he's talking about came with the label infamia. Infamia was a term of legal and cultural censure applied to individuals in ancient Rome. Being labeled as such stripped the individual of certain rights, such as the ability to vote or serve in the army, and other things like what we covered in the Tabula Heraclensis. However, notably, actors who performed in Atellan farces were not considered infamia. Leather cites Livy to back up his point, but this specific section actually mentions that Atellan farce actors were the exception to this rule. In addition, there are many examples of actors being privileged in Rome. Take this bit from Cicero, defending the actor Roscius by going so far as to say he's worthy of being a senator. And to paraphrase a line from Leather's citation document, Cicero must have been appealing to sentiments that existed at the time in Rome. I'm also going to link a very interesting article in the companion doc if you want to read about this more, but it's possible that the term infamia was only applied to certain types of actors. Now Leather talks about the 1st century AD satirical poet Juvenal, who he calls
Juvenal, a satirical playwright active from around 100 to 130 AD.
And to be very clear, he was not. He was a poet and actively railed against anyone performing his or other poems in public. In fact, his very first satire begins with, "What? Am I to be a listener only all my days? Am I never to get my word in? I, that have been so bored by the Thesid of the ranting Cordus?" We're specifically referencing
Juvenal's second satire, which viciously attacked men who deviated from the sexual norms at the time, with a strong focus on homosexuals. And the fact that this extremely popular play exists, which ruthlessly berates them, shows exactly what the people thought of homosexuals.
Leather is arguing Juvenal's satires were evidence of what the lower classes thought, as he's under the mistaken impression that he's a playwright. However, Juvenal's audience was likely wealthy, literate senators, not the largely illiterate plebeian class. Well, I can see how Leather and Richland, who he mostly got this from, can see this as sort of an invective against homosexuality. There's plenty of notes that I think actually can speak to the opposite a little bit. And Richland, to her credit at least, does go out of her way to include these examples. The whole second satire is mostly about hypocrisy. For example, at one point they have one guy sort of attacking another guy, and he's saying that it's that second guy's fault because he's just too attractive. So the first guy's blameless, that kind of stuff. In another note, he explicitly expresses that Pathics deserve our sympathies. He even says, quote, "Their passion itself deserves our forgiveness." In other Juvenal pieces, we actually have him taking sort of a pro-homosexual stance, including in his 6th satire, where he kind of suggests to a guy to maybe marry a boy instead of a woman. Overall, Juvenal was not writing for plebs or for the lower classes. He was actually writing for the elites. And if anything, this would indicate that the
85% of the city was engaging in these acts that the other 10 to 15% were so opposed to. Given that Juvenal explicitly states he's more okay with older men being with boys, this would almost imply that these adult male-male relationships were actually becoming more common in Rome at the time. There's even an interesting argument that in Juvenal's second satire, he talks about how men are getting married, not legally, just in this sort of religious ceremony. That was how the Roman religion recognized marriage. And some scholars, including Amy Richland, argue that this sort of implies an evidence that this was a growing trend in Rome at the time.
So Leather first wrongly states that the theater was only for the lower classes, which again, we already showed was wrong. The senators had reserved front row seats, and we even have Cicero talking about how everyone loves the theater. For his second point, Juvenal's second satire being evidence of what the lower classes thought, A, it wasn't a play, so only literate people would have been able to even consume it. B, as we've been over with Plautus, plenty of plays in the theater did have positive depictions of male-male relationships. And C, even for written works that only the elite would have been able to read, we have the Satyricon, a book popular about 30 years before Juvenal's second satire came out, where the main character is a man who is traveling with his, admittedly former at the time, male lover.
Even then, though, for Juvenal, I think you can actually draw a lot of similarities to the sort of modern boomer, like, wife bad joke. I don't necessarily think they're critiquing these institutions as a whole as much as they're necessarily just kind of like pointing out flaws in them and complaining about the institutions we have to deal with, rather than saying we need to abolish it. I don't think his sixth satire, which is against marriage, is basically saying that Romans at the time hated the idea of marriage and we should do without it altogether. It was more like, oh, it's so hard to find a good wife, women sleep around, blah, 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 blah. So again, I think that you can also kind of look at these with that view in mind, that these aren't necessarily purely invective.
Leather now pivots to what he claims were legal condemnations of homosexuality, starting with...
And passive homosexuality wasn't merely condemned socially, but legally as well, most notably by the Lex Scantinia.
Leather begins by pointing out, rightly, that
is subject to varied interpretations, mostly because we don't have the original texts in their entirety.
However, to give some evidence of what the law might have meant, Leather cites four main scholars: Wilkinson, McCary, Kroll, and Richland. He claims Wilkinson says,
forbids male homosexuality.
Now, he cites this horribly, giving the book but not the page number. So I managed to find the book and just kind of poured through it for any instance of the word Lex Scantinia. All I could find was on page 124 of my book, where it said, quote, "The old Republican Lex Scantinia forbade homosexual acts between free citizens." So free citizens, not in all its forms. It even goes on to say, nevertheless, in a world in which nothing was unmentionable and slavery abounded, it is likely that no sexual deviation went unsatisfied. Leather's claim is, McCary says,
it sets the death penalty for convicted homosexuals.
This text is in a brief footnote at the end of an article about one of Plautus's later plays. The footnote is specifically talking about the cult of Bacchus and how the man is using the initiation rites of this ancient cult as an excuse for essentially cheating on his wife with another man. Sorry, that's kind of relevant. Don't worry, we'll be analyzing this play later. The specific part of this footnote Leather is quoting, however, is not McCary's own words. It's actually from a professor friend of his who says he might want to look at the Lex Scantinia as it might be relevant. However, at the end of the footnote, McCary says he's not sure if the wording or timing of the law are remotely relevant to this play. He's not making a full-throated agreement with the professor he argued, however. If anything, he seems to think, I don't know if this is relevant, but I'm going to lean on the side of no, so I'm not going to really include it. The Kroll was the worst.
Some are more reserved and say that it simply banned pederasty.
I looked for it forever. I was even at one point literally just Googling like Kroll, Scantinia, and things like that. I found another article that referenced another thing that he wrote, but then I couldn't even find that thing that he wrote. The Tubernia is apparently just a list of like Latin and Greek texts with some commentaries, but he wrote two of them, so I don't even know which one Leather's referring to, and each is like 500 pages. And if you care about how long this took me, you could read the companion doc, but I can't find the quote, so I have no idea. Lastly, Leather claims Richland says,
penalized the willing passive homosexual partner.
And that's close, but not an exact quote. The line before, she says she's going to argue that there were restrictions on some male-male relationships. She goes on to say she will argue the Lex Scantinia penalized the free male who willingly let himself be penetrated. So, free male, not willing passive. This was originally written in English, so there's no translation issues or anything like that here. Later in the piece, she states, "A great deal of ink has been spilt over the question of whether homosexuality was illegal in Roman culture, largely based on the enigma attestations of the Lex Scantinia. It is my contention that this famous law is a red herring in the present context. Legislation was never the main source of social coercion in the massive institution of Roman law, yet even there's actually a footnote right after the word Scantinia. See, with his bibliography, Boswell, Christianity, page 63 to 71, and Liliha, page 112. The present discussion will argue against most of these writers' conclusion." Liliha argues that Valerius Maximus, in his stories from the early Republic about all these homosexual acts, never seems to reference a law that would condemn them or one of these laws being passed or anything like that. And in these stories, he'll even go on to say things like the whole college was against him, or these things that imply there wasn't really an established legal precedent for stuff like this. She also talks about Cicero, who has the earliest reference to this law that we can find, never seems to mention this or any other laws as being against Pathics, even though he frequently, in a lot of his orations, will attack his opponents for being Pathics and claim they should be censured under other laws for things that don't have anything to do with their sexuality. I'd also like to note that Cicero, in defense of a man on trial, says that this man took someone, a male, out into the countryside to satisfy his lusts. However, he then goes on to say, "But this is not a crime." I know there's a lot of text, so quickly, most translators translate crimen here as charge or accusation, which is one of the two common definitions. However, even in that instance, the implication is the accusation is criminal, not just a random invective. Just quickly before we move on, these are all stolen from Williams. In fact, Leather just made up the quotes. Like when he puts things in quotations, that's not what any of them actually said. And this also explains why he got the Richland bit wrong from a piece that he claimed to have read. He never actually tracked down any of this to make sure the quotes were accurate. Now, Leather is claiming the Lex Scantinia
was preserved in the Digest of Justinian, created in the early 6th century AD.
But it was not. There's actually no reference to the Lex Scantinia in the Digest whatsoever. Also, Leather here saying, scholars generally agree this accurately reflects the state of the law in Republican times is not true at all. Leather also gets the history of the law that he puts here a little bit wrong. Now, Leather got the first part of the history from Wikipedia, which he said earlier on was a bad source and tried to apologize for using it. But that part, to be fair, is at least correct. Though, again, a lot of this is speculation. The second part of his history, however, which he claims is still about the Lex Scantinia, is not. It's directly from Richland, and here she is talking about the law concerning infamia, something which, as we talked about earlier, involved a ton of people and was around way before even the Lex Scantinia. I think he jumbled these two together in his mind and never double-checked himself. And Richland, as we went over earlier, doesn't even think the Lex Scantinia was actually enforced all that often.
First, the law classifies those who are to be considered infames.
But this is not about the Lex Scantinia at all. This is a completely different thing. This part of the digest is talking about who can appear in court and breaks people down into one of three classes. Class 3 cannot be in court at all. Class 2 can be in court, but only if they are either the plaintiff or the defendant. And Class 1 can both bring their own cases to court and be in court on behalf of other people. Pathics were in Class 2, meaning they could bring cases to court, but only if they were the defendant or the plaintiff. And indeed, all persons labeled with infamia were in Class 2. So there was a space carved out that allowed known homosexuals to bring their own cases to court. They just couldn't be lawyers. What I do find funny is in that group, there is also women. The list of infamia comes in the next section, and it notably does not mention homosexuality at all. To Leather's credit, however, the earlier section did mention that if a man had been penetrated by force, he should not be labeled with infamy, which would imply that they should be if they had given it up willingly. He also left quite a few people off his list of who should be branded infamia, my favorite being a man who marries a widow too close to the death of her husband. Check the companion doc if you want to see the full list. This part, by the way, is almost entirely Richland.
People who were considered infames, according to the Lex Scantinia, are those condemned to death, those who fight animals for a living, actors, pimps, dishonorably discharged soldiers, as well as, quote, a man who has undergone womanish things in his body.
However, the type of person labeled infamia did change over the course of the empire. Notably, Augustus made adultery an infamia offense. As Leather is citing this law from Justinian under the Byzantine Empire, the question we have is, were Pathic men considered infamia prior to this period? And the evidence we have points to no. The closest we can look at is, again, the earlier Tablet of Heracles, which very specifically only mentions one who has made profit with their body, or a prostitute. However, there are a lot of similarities between these two things, both the Digest and the Tabula Heraclenses, which I think is much more evident of Roman attitudes towards this thing shifting than Roman attitudes towards homosexuality being stagnant. So again, Leather is using laws written roughly 400 years after he believes the empire stopped being gay to prove that Romans hated being gay during that time. He does mention other works that could give us a view into what Romans thought of homosexuality under the empire. Before I even get into this, this is from Williams.
The author Ausonius wrote in an epigram that the semivir, or half-man, a colloquial term for a sexual passive, fears the Scantinian law.
Real quick, semivir was not just colloquial for a passive. Ausonius himself uses the term to refer to a hermaphrodite. Ausonius was a Roman poet and rhetorician who actually tutored Constantine the Great's sons. His 91st epigram goes as follows. To a lawyer who has a faithless wife. A lawyer who had a faithless wife approved of the Papian statue, but disapproved of the Julian. Do you ask why this difference? Effeminate himself, fearing the Scantinian, he feared not the Titian law. So this is a bit of a joke, but not quite about being gay. The Titian law, as pointed out here, was a law to ensure that children who had no parents, either because they were orphans or because their parents were banished, would be appointed male guardians. So the joke is this guy who liked young boys seemed to fear a law which some scholars argue probably punished relations with young boys. However, he was a big fan of the law that forced male guardians onto young boys. However, taking a look at some of Ausonius' other epigrams shows that he's not 100% anti-gay here. His 94th epigram is about a man marrying a woman who is going to sleep around. It begins with, Zoile, you're gay, and now you're married to a prostitute. And he actually goes on to say about how they're going to make a bunch of money and he'll probably be really happy, but that he needs to caution himself because he's going to get old, lose his looks, and lose his clients. And then if he wants sex, because he wasn't able to marry someone who wants to have sex with him, he'll have to start paying for it. Even epigram 78 is about a man named Castor. It's a very sad story about a man who is looking for a man's member to use his mouth on, but he is unable to find a man whose member he can use his mouth on. So instead, he has to go home and lick his wife, which is just, really sad, honestly. Real tearjerker, that one. Most of the epigrams we've covered up until now have sort of been funny and jokes, but he does actually have some quite serious and moving ones. And I specifically want to touch on his 53rd epigram, which is about a young boy who died too soon. The whole epigram is mourning the young boy with an incredibly serious tone, but it actually ends by saying that he will be either a lover to Persephone or a catamite to Hades. The whole epigram isn't really meant to be funny. This isn't supposed to be a joke at the end of it. He was very clearly saddened by this youth's death. But if anything, the fact that he's saying you're going to a better place, your afterlife is, the god of death will have sex with you, kind of implies his thoughts on the matter and that it wasn't a wholly negative thing and even might be a pretty good way to spend the afterlife. Leather then goes back to Juvenal's second satire, something he will go back to quite a bit, and talks about a scene in which
the law is referenced by a woman chatting with a homosexual man. She also tells him that he ought to fear the Scantinian law.
But that word fear is not in the Latin or any translation I could find. The actual text of that specific scene is, if it's a matter of quoting neglected laws and statutes, cite the Scantinian laws before all the rest, which actually offers a really interesting look at how often the Julian and Scantinian laws may have actually been enforced. the fact that she uses the word neglected, I think is very significant. He then also mentions
The 3 Christian writers who commented on the Lex Scantinia all described it as, quote, fearsome.
but he doesn't mention any of them by name. So I just kind of Googled 3 Christian writers, Scantinian law and fearsome, and I got a bit from Richland, where she says that there were 3 writers who called the law fearsome, but then she only cites one of them, and it's actually saying that there was a bishop who didn't fear the Scantinian law. So I don't know. Additionally, if you recall that story from Livy at the beginning of this video, and there was a person by the name of Scantinia who forcefully engaged with boys, there's a chance this law was protecting young boys against assault, as we do have other examples of boys being in relationships willingly. So just to wrap up, we don't really know what the Lex Scantinia was referencing, but there's a pretty good case to be made that it was mostly to protect young boys. And it never was in the digest at all. After a brief tangent talking about slurs, Leather again then says,
now, if you were to argue this, the pro-gay scholars would actually agree with you. Yes, of course, the sexual passive was always detested throughout Roman history.
which again, I think I've disproven enough. I'm not even going to really give more examples at this point. I was, before I started doing all this research, actually inclined to agree with Leather. I was not honestly expecting to disagree with him about this part. But as I looked into it more and more, and I kept finding all these examples, again, it sort of challenged how I had thought about how Romans viewed homosexuality. And now Leather gets into the first thing I actually wanted to fight with him about, the active partner.
The active partner, they would say, the one who actually did the penetrating, was always accepted. Now, before doing the research for this video, I'd always thought that, while of course it isn't impossible that this idea existed, it never made sense to me on a logical level. Why would the Romans consider it a grave sin to be penetrated, but not realize that it takes 2 to tango? And indeed, if we examine the historical record, we find not a small number of examples of the sexually active partner in a homosexual encounter being denounced.
Leather's first quote is from the Roman historian Plutarch, where he is talking about a sort of senatorial fight that was happening between Clodius and Pompey. Clodius is attacking Pompey by essentially doing a call and response with the men that are sort of part of his political faction. He says, "Who is a licentious imperator? What man seeks for a man? Who scratches his head with the one finger?" And the men respond, "Pompey," every time he kind of shakes his toga. This bit was from the Edwards. Fun fact, this quote actually shows up in the Williams and Richland as well, but not with this specific wording. Funner fact, Williams and Richland just cite line 47, not, as Leather cites it, 45 to 47. This is because it is just from line 47. Edwards' original quote just included a couple lines before the line Leather's quoting, and he didn't think about that when he cut the quote in half. Scratching your head with one finger was actually seen as a Pathic trait, because it was thought that you cared too much about your appearance. And if you only scratch your head with one finger, you were trying not to mess up your hairdo. Because anyway. Additionally, this was just outside the Senate, where most of these political insults were having to do with men being Pathic, not with men taking the active role. Leather actually knows this because he covered this exact quote in an earlier section he had about effeminacy, and how Romans viewed effeminates as having some Pathic qualities.
But even beyond the actual act of submitting to being the passive partner itself, doing anything that made yourself appear more feminine also opened you up to censure, to being deemed effeminatus, or moles. In fact, men who were caught scratching their head with one finger were often deemed effeminatus, because it was thought that they were trying to avoid messing up their hairdo, and this is something that only a pansy would care about.
I skipped that section of Leather's video in my own coverage because, A, he and I largely agreed the Romans weren't big fans of effeminacy, but B, men were often accused of effeminate behaviors in the Senate without necessarily accusations of Pathicism, because again, for the Romans, it was more about gender roles. So being effeminate in some way flew in the face of the gender role thing and didn't necessarily imply Pathicism. It sort of felt like a sidestep to the issue for me. Leather next quotes Seneca, telling the story of a man who was
impure not with one sex only, but was eager for men as well as for women, specifying that his active homosexual sex brought on at least part of the disgust.
This is actually a great example of how Leather will often miss context because he just doesn't read the works he's citing. This comes from a pretty early paragraph in Seneca's work, Natural Questions. And it's in a section where Seneca is mostly talking about mirrors, but then also comparing them to things like mirages and rainbows and things which look real but aren't. In fact, right before the paragraph Leather is referencing, Seneca says, "For we judge that in a mirror there is nothing but a deception. The mirror only pretends to show a foreign body. What is revealed does not exist in the mirror. Indeed, in certain instances, people have so arranged mirrors that the objects have been distorted and degraded in the reflection. Seneca then goes on in the next paragraph to talk about how that man used mirrors to distort his own body and those of his partners. The specific part of his body he distorted to look much bigger than it actually was, because he enjoyed looking at that. This would imply that he was being the passive or Pathic partner. It'd be a little tough to look at that part of your body during an act if you were playing the active role. As anyone who has done the act can tell you, so maybe Leather doesn't know that. The Seneca bit was taken from Williams. Fun fact, this specific translation can only be found in the Williams piece, meaning Leather can't have gotten it from anywhere else. Funner fact, Williams is pretty clear about this man playing the passive role, indicating both he took it in with his mouth and he derived pleasure from being penetrated. So he must have read that analysis and chose to ignore it. Seneca also, just to be clear, was accused by the historian Dio of not living up to his own ideals, especially with regards to opulence, and even engaging in love affairs with young boys. He then moves on to Catullus' 10th poem.
Refers negatively to a praetor as erumator, one who orally penetrates another.
He then goes on to say,
And in this case, he is referring to that act being done to a man.
there is zero evidence of that. This is a straight up lie. The main point of Catullus 10 is that he has been with this magistrate who's been appointed governor of this area, and he is upset because the governor is not letting Catullus or the other members of this guy's court kind of skim off the top and basically enrich themselves at the expense of the local population. And he's complaining about all this to a prostitute who's a local of this area. It ends with him trying to impress the prostitute by claiming he owns a bunch of slaves, but those slaves aren't actually his. It's essentially borrowed wealth that he didn't earn, much like the wealth he's trying to suck out of this province that he didn't earn. So in the end, he kind of realizes he's in the same position as the prostitute, but to save his pride, he says like, okay, well, but you know what, prostitute? You at least can't afford to be careless. I can screw up every now and then because I do have social standing, I guess. If anything, the praetor is held up as the good moral guy in this story, and Catullus is kind of held up as the fool. As we talked about before, my favorite poem, Catullus 16, has him threatening to erumate those two men who were calling him soft. If being an erumator and receiving erumation was such a negative thing to Catullus, why would he then go on and threaten to basically be in that position? And one really easy way to interpret this is this guy's more worried about getting his dick sucked than trying to help us get rich. Now we're going to move on to
The case of Miles Marianus, or the Marian soldier. This soldier in 104 BC was propositioned by his tribune. Not only did the soldier reject him, but killed him in retaliation for the insult. Marius, who was related to the slain tribune, ruled it a case of justifiable homicide.
No. First off, this wasn't a proposition. This was a fairly brutal assault. In the very first declamation Leather cites, it states at the beginning that he tried to forcibly assault the boy. The rest all basically agree with this. The later Cicero part uses the specific phrase vim sibi, or basically, tried to force himself as a man onto the boy. The Quintilian again uses that same phrase, vim sibi. Then that second Quintilian part, which, by the way, screw you, was so difficult to find online. I could literally only find a translation into English from like the 1600s, where like S's are still those like long F things. Anyway, all the language implied force. The last source agrees with the rest, actually being far more explicit. Caius Lucius was enamored of one of the young men who served under him by name Trebonius, and had, on several occasions, made unsuccessful attempts to seduce him. But finally, at night, he sent a servant with summons for Trebonius. The young man came, since he could not refuse to obey a summons, but when he had been introduced into the tent, and Caius attempted violence upon him, he drew his sword and slew him. So he didn't kill him when he was propositioned any of the other times, only when violence was offered. This isn't a story about being gay, it's about consent and assault. If the story was about a woman, I don't think the Romans would have viewed it any differently. Leather, for the Marian soldier, puts the quotes in the exact same way that Williams does in his citations. I will say for the Marian soldier, a little bit shame on Williams. He presents it the exact same way Leather claimed it was in his video, but Williams at least puts it in a section that has more to do with, like I said, forcing themselves on young boys. So half point to Williams, 0 to Leather. Now we'll finally talk about Epictetus, the slave turned freedman turned philosopher who went on to be very influential in the Stoic school of thought. The passage that Leather keeps citing is,
what does the Pathic lose? He loses the character of man. What does he lose who makes the Pathic what he is? Many other things. And he also loses the man no less than the other.
Now, Leather seems to indicate that this is pretty explicitly condemning homosexuality. And he's not completely wrong, but there's some other context around Epictetus that I want to provide. Firstly, Epictetus actually has other passages that seem far more accepting of homosexual sex. For example, have you, who are able to turn around others, no master? Is not money your master? A girl or a boy or some tyrant? 4:115. Did you never love a person, a young girl, young boy, slave, or free? Important note here, in most translations in the English I could find, they don't translate the boy part. However, the original Greek is, I don't speak Greek, but it's, which most accurately translates to no female child, no male child, no slave, no free. In the Enchiridion 33, Epictetus tells us not to judge others based on their habits. As far as possible, before marriage, keep yourself pure from familiarities with women, and, if you indulge them, let it be lawfully. But don't therefore be troublesome and full of reproofs for those who use these liberties. Before you get on my case that it only says woman, the Greek is, which is just sexual desire. A lot of these translation issues are things you run into with older texts. Leather himself actually referenced this at the very beginning of his video, even showing parts that just straight up weren't translated by certain translators. But a lot of times when they see something about sex with men, they'll throw in the word unnatural. To be fair, this does happen in the other direction as well. You have plenty of people trying to read gay things into history that aren't there. I have thoughts on Elagabalus, but anyway. For my last example, in 4:11, when talking about cleanliness, this straw man makes the argument of, oh, but Socrates didn't bathe a lot, and he was clean. Epictetus's response is, yet his person looked clean, and was so agreeable and pleasing that the most beautiful noble youths were fond of him, and desired rather to sit by him than by those who had the finest persons. Now again, to get back into the translation issues, this is from the 1890s. The word for sit by him is, which is the present perfect infinitive of, I honestly love the Perseus library. It made a lot of this research much, much easier. Anyway, they define it as to lay down beside or to put to bed with. This is where we can look at where he uses other examples of that word and see what it means in those instances. And he uses it again at 2:18:16. Today, when I saw a handsome person, I did not say to myself, I wish I could lie with her. A very clear sexual innuendo, especially as the next line is, happy is her husband. Within these works, these are the only two instances of Epictetus using this word, at least according to the Perseus library. So I think it's safe to assume here that he is saying Socrates was sleeping with these boys. And that was a result of him being clean. So almost a reward for the thing Epictetus is telling other men to do. Now let's go back to the quote Leather mentioned. And again, he does seem to be using my translation, the Long from 1890. So the passage in Attic Greek is as follows. Now the part I want to focus on is here. Long translates this part as, what does he lose who makes the Pathic what he is? However, the most literal translation of these Greek words are essentially, and the arranger. Looking at a Greek dictionary, we can see a lot of instances of this word being used for placing or arranging, much like setting the table or arranging flowers. But none of it really meaning use or make use of. Now, just like before, we can take a look at other instances of this work appearing within Epictetus's work. And there are, in fact, about 6 instances of this word popping up. You can check the companion doc if you'd like to see my specific thoughts on all of these, but none of them, suffice to say, have anything to do with sort of making someone do something. So now to my argument. I think this might have been about pimping. This list of what the Pathic and the arranger loses come in a list of other people who also lose things when they perform immoral acts. And this list is including things like someone who's angry or an adulterer or a coward. However, the very next line is about how you might be able to make money off these things. Yet in the results of cowardness, anger, or adultery, there would be no monetary gain. Even additionally, with just a normal Pathic and homosexual top relationship, there would be no monetary gain. However, if this is referring to someone pimping out a homosexual Pathic, there could be monetary gain. Again, I haven't studied much ancient Greek, and I admit this is
sort of my harebrained conspiracy theory. So if you don't buy it, that is totally fine. It was strange to me that he had so many quotes saying, maybe homosexuality isn't so bad. And then this one quote that seemed to be just so completely despising of the whole thing. It was interesting to me to kind of hold those two opposite viewpoints. And this felt like a way in my head where I could sort of like at least marry those two and get some sort of cohesive ideology out of these quotes.
For Epictetus, this one's a little less clear. I'm inclined to believe that Leather got this from Macmillan, because the way he does the citation, Macmillan does it the exact same way. And if you Google Epic to 1017 like this, your first result is from the Perseus Library, which has that long translation we talked about. Other sources that I can find that do include the quote tend to translate this part differently. So that's the main reason I'm making this claim.
Leather now moves on to a story from Tacitus that takes place under the reign of Emperor Claudius.
Suilius Caesonius narrowly avoided execution for his involvement in Messalina's orgy. According to Tacitus, this is because he was a passive partner in the acts.
He goes on, not in the video but in the footnote, to say the fact that the Pathic male was forgiven would imply that the active homosexual partner at the top would not have been. Otherwise, why mention this man's orientation? However, again, that is a terrible misreading of the circumstances. Claudius's wife had been sleeping around while he was out of town, so much so that she had actually married another man and tried to get that man proclaimed emperor. Upon finding out about this, Claudius goes home and begins executing everyone who had slept with his wife. In one instance, an actor even rips his clothes off and shows that he had been whipped and beaten, implying he hadn't wanted to sleep with the empress, he had been forced. Claudius almost forgives this man, but then reflects that whether or not he had wanted to commit the crime, he still had committed it, and it was a very grave crime indeed. This Pathic man, on the other hand, the whole point is that he, as a Pathic, would have had no desire to penetrate, and therefore he is forgiven because he never actually committed the crime of laying with the emperor's wife. If anything, this example actually runs counter to Leather's points up until now. This man was the son of a senator, wielding enormous political power, and a very well-known Pathic. Leather again lists about 4 quotes that he doesn't actually use in his video, one of them being the Claudius quote that we literally just covered, but see the companion doc for my thoughts on those.
For Suilius Caesonius, Leather did at the very least track this down, and he's using the same source I'm using for the annals. How do I know? Because in his copy and paste, he kept the footnotes complete with hyperlinks in them. He did steal the original idea for this from Richelin, however.
Suilius Caesonius narrowly avoided execution for his involvement in Messalina's orgy. According to Tacitus, this is because he was a passive partner in the acts.
We're now going to move on to slaves, which usually most scholars will agree would have been an okay thing for a Roman male to engage with. However, Leather is claiming
some Romans likely abused their male slaves, but this wasn't exactly an uncontested practice.
To prove this, his first quote is from a Quintilian declamation, which he claims Quintilian says,
"You rich don't marry. You only have those toys of yours, those boy slaves that play women for you."
This quote is completely wrong. These words are not in the Latin or any English translation I can find, and the way he is framing the story is incredibly incorrect. The words "don't marry, you only have" are not in the Latin at all. The English translation from the Loeb is as follows: "You lost your house, fortune's grievous injury, to live in a new one, but you lost your wife. Even her you don't miss much. For how you rich men remodel your marriages. Remodel, other pleasures carry you off. Those servants, those boys imitating women." The rough story of the case is there is essentially a poor man and a rich man. And the poor man basically led like a small rebellion against the rich man and destroyed the rich man's house and his family. The rich man then later gets an army and destroys the poor man's house and his family. Now the poor man is going to the Senate and is asking for permission to unalive himself. The rich man is arguing that he shouldn't be able to unalive himself because the rich man has suffered the exact same things as the poor man, and he doesn't want to do that. Poor man's argument for the whole time is that rich people have an easier time of life than poor people, even with the exact same problems. So not only do those ellipses in Leather's original quote skip a ton, they literally change the meaning. If anything, the poor man is arguing, I lose my wife, I'm alone. You use your wife. At least you have these slaves.
If anything, he's envious. So where did leather get this from?
It's from McMullen. Remember when I talked about him making up quotes? This is one of the clearest examples of that. No one else I could find inserted these extra words, so I'm pretty sure he did this himself.
McMullen even puts in the footnote, illa ministeria, illa imitati feminas pueri. That's the original Latin, but it just translates to your servants, your boys imitating women. McMullen also goes on to say in that same passage that the poor man goes on to say people of his class settle down and have families. Again, that is nowhere in the original text. To be fair, this is only on leather insofar as he didn't actually track down the sources. McMullen is the one who did this translation and added these extra words that completely changed the meaning. However, Leather should have double-checked him.
There is a bad faith part of me that thinks he did catch this and just chose to ignore it.
Ironic that Leather, who believes the pro-gay scholars are uncritically pushing their own agenda.
They attempt to paint Rome as a progressive place in which being gay was commonplace and even accepted. So much like how these older scholars were interpreting Rome through their own contemporary lenses, modern scholars take our own society's acceptance of homosexuality and apply it to ancient Rome, and we end up with a myriad of popular misunderstandings for it. To associate the ancient Romans with homosexuality, to say that it was unproblematic for them, it's not only a lie, but it implicitly argues for the acceptance of homosexuality today, which reeks of political bias.
Ended up just taking something from a scholar without double checking it, thereby uncritically pushing his own agenda. I honestly might have let him off the hook for this one if it weren't for the way he just presented as like, I've read 10,000 sources and know so much. Like, at the very least, if he would have said, oh, hey, I got this from McMullen who says this, there's a little bit more plausible deniability. But when you sit there and you're just like,
I will be showing through hundreds of references to primary documents, literally hundreds of quotes, requires ignoring the mountains of evidence that people denounced. At least in my research, these quotes are more numerous and they come from, without mentioning what I found to be the far more numerous examples. I could easily list several dozen more examples without exhausting all that I've come across.
No. Anyway, moving on. Leather's next story is about a man who is on trial for engaging in illegal concubinage.
The orator Haterius attempted in court to defend a freedman who had become a concubine to his patron.
And again, his framing of this one is a little bit off. Concubines to the ancient Romans were a little different from how we think of them today. They were essentially a legally recognized union, typically between people of different classes. However, it did come with some legal protections. The offspring of, any union between a concubine and their owner, essentially, would not count as legitimate children towards the inheritance. But fun fact, concubines could also not be sold or seized to pay for a debt.
Also, Leather's on-screen comment here saying this man was on trial for being passive is incorrect. More likely, it was because you were not allowed to have both a concubine and a legal spouse at the same time. Interestingly, Catullus gives us a great example of this, saying in his 61st poem that a groom, after his marriage, will have to give up his concubinus, the male form of the Latin word for concubine.
Anyway, back to the story. This man who used to be a slave was freed by his master and is now accused of being the master's concubine. And Haterius, a lawyer, is arguing for him with the following quote.
Unchastity is a matter of reproach for freeborns, a matter of duty for freedmen, and a matter of necessity for male slaves.
Seneca then goes on to say everyone basically laughs at him and it becomes like a running joke in Rome. Where people are going around saying like, oh, you're not doing your duty by me. Clearly, this is supposed to be like a comedic moment, and the orator is clearly either misspeaking or just making a very bad argument. But I don't know that this is necessarily the best evidence for how slaves were treated, given that one, the man is not a slave, and then two, it's unclear if this argument is actually like an argument that carried any water. Leather claims for some reason that the lawyer then goes on,
and adding that male slaves have absolutely no say in the matter.
That never happens in this story. Williams, who Leather stole this from, does himself make an offhand remark that slaves had no say in the matter, but Haterius never actually claims that, and Williams never claims that Haterius actually said that. The next example is a quote from a praetor who was coming back to Rome during the late Republic, like 150 BC-ish. Now, Leather cites this incorrectly for some reason. He sends us to the Satyricon, but luckily I can just Google the quote and find that he stole it from Williams, and so I can track down Williams' footnote and just do it that way. The quote Leather gives here is essentially Gaius Gracchus saying that while he was out on campaign, he essentially never made use of anyone's slave boys.
This quote tells us a few things pretty clearly. First, that the popular morality would have condemned sex with slave boys right alongside prostitutes.
Leather is sort of indicating here that because he's going out of his way to indicate that he didn't even touch the slave boys, that while it does mean it happened, the fact that he's using this to demonstrate his virtue shows that it likely was frowned upon. However, again, he's missing the much, much larger context of what's actually happening.
This wasn't an invective against sleeping with male slaves. This was mostly him answering a charge of embezzling funds. His speech is mostly about how temperate he was and how he actually lost money during his governorship.
He is talking about how other people left with a bunch of jars full of wine and they brought them back full of gold, whereas he left with, a full purse and came back with zero money. So him pointing out that he was not with anyone's slaves is not him saying that like, oh, look, I didn't even touch the slaves, see how noble I am. It's more like I was so focused on making sure that everything was done for Rome and everything was being done for the soldiers that I didn't even impose on your sons. Much further, I didn't even impose on your sons' slaves. Williams, who again Leather stole this from, also points out that he doesn't mention anything about his own slave boys. So it's also entirely possible he traveled with his own slave boys and was using them just fine. To next prove that, again, sex with slaves was sort of viewed negatively, he cites Juvenal, who he still calls a playwright, and
another playwright named Plautus also included jokes at the expense of slaves.
Who was a playwright, so good job on that one. He claims these quotes show that slaves and masters had sex, but that it was always painted in a negative light, or somehow was just frowned upon, and that again, he's arguing that because it was in the theater, this would have been the opinion of the plebeians. Interestingly, though, he kind of gets the quotes backwards again. So the Juvenal quote, which...
Do you think it's an easy or straightforward thing to shove a proper into his guts, there to run into yesterday's dinner? The slave who has plowed the field will be less miserable than the one who has plowed the master.
So the full context is, this man is not a slave. Juvenal's just talking to a prostitute. And in this story, this prostitute sees both male and female clients. However, he's getting older. And as a result of getting older, he's losing his looks. So he is really worried because he doesn't have enough money to retire. And Juvenal, throughout the entire satire, is actually quite comforting to the man, saying such things as, you'll never lack for a gay man as long as the 7 hills of Rome stand tall. Why don't you try old women instead? They'll pay anyone. The whole satire isn't really like negative in the way that Leather seems to be trying to paint it. Back to the specific quote Leather was talking about, though, that's within a scene where he's referencing that, he'll be hired to basically have sex with a rich man. And then, the rich man's having a dinner party or something. So there's like wine and a bunch of other things being passed out. And then at the end of the night, it comes out time to like divvy up everyone's pay. And he's like, I make as much as a slave. And he's like, that's insane. The work I do is much harder. Leather's trying to show this as like, this man hates his work. But if anything, it's actually about a man taking pride in his work. His Plautus references are a little bit more interesting. He listed the plays, but not the scenes. I'm assuming because he just took this right from the Williams again. But for some reason, he just didn't follow the Williams footnotes, which have the scenes. I'll quickly provide context and then cite so that you can read for yourself below. The first from Pseudolus is this line in reference to trying to out if this man is an imposter.
When the soldier went out at night on guard duty and you went with him, did his sword fit into your sheath?
The title character had pretended to be this guy earlier in order to spirit away a beautiful prostitute for his master. However, both characters are slaves. The one in the scene is just confused because he's not having sex with his master. He just keeps asking, like, what are you talking about? And then they keep making the jokes. And he starts just being like, okay, you guys are really, really weird. And then at the end, they like try and take his shoes or something. And he's just like, help, help, because he's just like, these guys are insane. I have no idea what's going on. It actually is a pretty funny scene. It's funny for something written like, 2,200 years ago. It's not bad. It's not bad. The second scene from Asarina is
a slave actually tells his master to assume a passive position on his hands and knees. Quote, like you used to when you were a boy.
So in this scene, a slave has come into some money through dishonest means that now his master wants. And so the slave says, all right, well, if you want this money, then you have to do whatever I say. And one of the things he says is you have to carry me around. I saw one footnote that said this likely isn't sexual and might be referencing a childhood game the Romans would play, like Leapfrog or something like that. But I found plenty of other people disagreeing with that take. So I guess you can read for yourself and make up your own mind. However, I'd argue that either way, this would indicate that this man, a freeborn male who's wealthy enough to own slaves, who earlier in the scene was with a female prostitute, was a Pathic when a boy, but no longer is, which kind of offers an interesting view as to how Romans might have viewed Pathicism. Perhaps it was actually okay to do this when you were a boy, and then you could enter society as a man without any stain on your reputation whatsoever. However, even if it is sexual, the play, The Ass Dealer, is full of male-on-male sexual innuendo. So even if the joke is, haha, this guy used to be a Pathic, I'd argue it's more of like an inside group joke, more akin to a gay joke you might find on RuPaul than one you might find in, I don't know, like a 90s comedy film or something of that ilk.
The final scene is from Casina, and it's actually one of the ones I wanted to reference way back when I was talking about depictions of relationships between two adult males.
One male slave notices another being propositioned by their master, and he says to the audience, "My God, I do believe this guy wants to dig up the bailiff's bladder."
So essentially, the plot of Casina is there is a rich man who took in a young girl who was left on his doorstep. So he took her in as a slave. Her name's Casina. He wants to basically make her his slave's concubine so that he can have sex with her whenever he wants.
However, the rich man's son also wants Casina to be his concubine, and he has the support of the rich man's wife, the boy's mother. So the end of the play is essentially the rich man's wife tricks the rich man and his slave Olympio into stealing who they think is Casina, but is actually a guy. And it ends with them feeling around and going like, oh, you know, why is there something hard there when there should be something soft? And funny joke.
Anyway, in this scene, the rich man is essentially talking to that slave, Olympio, and starts to say that he actually loves him. And they're being overseen by another slave. Leather says in the quote, it's like,
"My God, I do believe this guy wants to dig up the bailiff's bladder."
And sure, that line is in there, but again, I'd argue this is more of a RuPaul Insider Baseball type joke. As, I don't know, show me the homophobic play where you have two male characters make out on stage for 5 minutes and constantly allude to a sexual past with each other. So even if, as Leather claims,
They all discuss the issue in a negative light, or they have some sort of pathetic comic relief character saying it for laughs.
the openly shown male-on-male loves, including, again, a slave who used to and possibly still is the lover of his master, are clearly not played for laughs. They're just shown as relationships presented as normal in the context of the play.
next, Leather brings up some quotes that he believes condemns sex with slaves in general. And the first one, to be fair, he knocks out of the park. Almost. This quote is from the 1st century AD Stoic philosopher Musonius Rufus, and it's a part of his 12th lecture on sex and sexual desire. Leather quotes this moment from it.
If one is to behave temperately, one would not dare to have relations with a prostitute, nor with a free woman outside of marriage, nor even by Zeus with one's own slave woman.
So Rufus here is completely condemning sex with slaves. Leather is completely correct about that. However, what he leaves out is he goes on to condemn literally all sex that is not for procreation. What he was advocating for was an incredibly outrageous position in Rome, even at this time. The next quote, which Leather merely just says is Cato decrying the buying of slave boys, is again lifted straight from the Macmillan.
Cato is known to have condemned the buying of slave boys, especially of one L. Cornelius Scipio. Why the invective against this one man in particular if the practice was so widespread?
The full story is about this man basically has this boy slave, and this boy used to be part of a troop of gladiators, but he ran away from the gladiators to join this senator. So this relationship does seem to be consensual. Apparently one night after they drunk a bit and, they were getting all touchy-flirty and feely, the boy lamented that he never actually got to see someone die. Now at that moment, a noble Boian, which is essentially this Celtic tribe in like Cisalpine Gaul, Rome was kind of having trouble with at the time, basically comes into camp and says, he wants to defect. The senator, upon hearing this, turns to the boy and says, "Do you still want to see a guy die?" And according to Livy, the boy nods, but he's kind of half-hearted about it. And then the senator gets up and stabs the guy. And the guy starts screaming and running through camp, calling for help, while the senator just like drunkenly chases him down and just brutally hacks him to death. So all of the punishments against him were levied because of this crime. Him being with the slave boy was incidental, and the slave boy isn't even like blamed for this execution. Lastly, Leather talks about a soldier forced to commit self-delete in the battle after buying slave boys. And I'll let Leather even say what makes him so curious about this story.
Not Roman citizens, but captives from a war. Not even Italians. Why was this punished so harshly?
And I can answer all those questions. Firstly,
The soldier was not just buying random slave boys. These were boys who'd been captured and were meant to be public slaves. Public slaves in Rome usually were under direct supervision of the Senate, and so a lot of times they just kind of ended up being slaves for the senators, but ostensibly they were supposed to work on public works projects. So when you made a new road, these public slaves would come and build that road for the people. So he's basically stealing from the Roman people. And given Cato's position in the Senate, he's arguably stealing from Cato himself. However, also, when the soldier found out that Cato had found out, the soldier just
Self-delete.
Cato didn't make him self-delete or anything like that. He chose to do that voluntarily rather than face Cato's wrath. Also, Cato basically immediately resold them and put the money back in the public treasury. Leather then claims Tacitus says,
even the slaves at orgies, which some might assume to be blameless, were condemned.
but for this he cites Tacitus's famous historical work, the Annals, but he cites Book 37. There is no Book 37 of the Annals. Quick reminder, up to this point, we've had several notable men from Roman history either outright agreeing with or engaging in sexual relationships with slaves, with the famous conservative Cato going so far as to essentially punish his son for passive-aggressively disapproving of his relationship. So again, as I think we've shown, sex with slave probably was common, and it probably wasn't looked down upon in the way Leather is saying it was. Leather now pivots to
the last area in which pro-gay scholars seek refuge for their theories is in the so-called pederastic relationships of Rome.
Leather's first footnote to kind of back this up is him just saying a bunch of stuff, and he doesn't really source any of it. But the main thrust of this is Romans only would have accepted a pederastic homosexual relationship if it was a free man and a slave. I've already provided a bunch of evidence to the contrary here, but I think it'd be interesting to look at some other erotic poetry as well. So we'll look at Virgil and Horace. Now, Virgil was a very, very famous Roman poet working in the 1st century BC to kind of like 1st century AD. He actually worked under Augustus. He wrote the Aeneid, which was actually commissioned by Augustus. And Virgil wrote a lot of eclogues and a lot of just random poems as well that were very, very popular, very well published, and very well read in his time. In Virgil's 3rd eclogue, we have two shepherds basically going back and forth in like the ancient Roman version of a rap battle. They're basically just doing like 2 lines of poetry back and forth, back and forth. One of the shepherds is possibly a slave, but the other shepherd we know for a fact is free because he's tending to his parents' flock. The slave shepherd at the very beginning of the poem actually accuses the freed shepherd of essentially being a Pathic and getting it on in a bush in the nearby clearing.
But the free shepherd responds that he wasn't Pathic. He was in fact just topping young boys.
The slave shepherd does seem to be completely straight. At one point, they go back and forth talking about loves, and the slave shepherd just lists like 3 women, essentially. But the freed shepherd actually lists 2 boys and 1 woman. And the boys, again, are sort of implied to be free in the way that he's talking about them. Because if they were his slaves, you know, why would he necessarily have to pine for them or lust after them or talk about them like this? Horace, a poet writing around the same time as Virgil, imagines a friend of his chiding him for his passions for girls and boys in thousands. In one of his epodes, or epodes, however you say that, he remarks that he burns with passion for tender boys, passion for tender girls. Just to give you a brief idea of how popular and prominent Horace was even in his own time, he was offered the role of being Augustus's personal secretary, a role which he turned down. Not only did he not suffer any kind of repercussions for essentially sort of disrespecting the emperor, Augustus continued to pursue Horace to try and make him his personal secretary. Yet despite his fame and enough financial stability to turn down a cushy job at the imperial palace, he never married, choosing instead to live with his patron in the countryside, a patron who, as we know, had affairs with both men and women. Make of that what you will.
I also found this section from Herodian's history, where the Emperor Commodus, one after Marcus Aurelius, was said to sleep with a young boy he kept around the palace, and went about naked. Note 2, when Herodian says certain luxury-obsessed Romans, quote, always took delight in these lads.
There is evidence of at least sort of engaging with free boys. So Leather's next claim, I'm just going to play it its entirety.
I think the author of Roman Homosexuality put it very well when he wrote, pederastic relationships seem to have been no more objectionable to Roman traditionalists than were relationships with freeborn girls or with other men's wives.
Leather is very, very much cherry picking here. In fact, the very next sentence is, in fact, I will argue later in this chapter that adultery, another subset of stuprum, gave rise to a higher level of cultural anxiety than did pederasty. I do appreciate that Leather included the word traditionalist in his on-screen quote, because I do think that word actually does a lot of heavy lifting. Indeed, if you keep reading the Williams piece, he makes it very clear that pederasty on the whole was not entirely condemned. Later in his book, Williams states, the beautiful boy, puer, was an acceptable, even idealized object of Roman men's penetrative desires. He even goes on to point out a scene in the Satyricon where an older man is growing tired because his younger partner desires to be penetrated so much. It's actually kind of a funny scene. I'll link it for you. But going off the original Williams quote, Leather now takes a slight detour to argue that
adultery was hated by the Romans. There was even a strict set of laws passed to curb it.
I do feel like this doesn't have like a ton to do with our main topic, but at this point I'm just mad over how little research he did, that like I'm doing research to spite him, which really feels like the wrong way to go about things. But anyway, Leather begins by referencing
the Julian law on punishing adulteries.
Very, very briefly, this was a law that punished adultery and also introduced tax breaks for people who were married and people who had children. Although it might be more accurate to say it introduced taxes if you didn't fit that criteria. In terms of the punishment for adultery, on paper at least, it was quite harsh, going so far as to even banish the adulterous party and their affair partner. Though note, adultery required one of the parties to be a married woman. A married man was free to sleep with prostitutes and never married non-virgins, all he wanted without running afoul of this law. This is relevant given the focus of this video is men being with men. He claims that
this law also allowed a husband to kill the partner of his cheating wife if that partner was infamous.
Firstly, the man did not need to be infamia. But secondly, there were a ton of restrictions on whether or not a husband could end his wife's lover. The big restrictions were the husband could only kill the man if he caught him in his own house. Adultery, while frowned upon, really didn't seem to be restricted all that much. Even Tiberius, the second emperor, when he came to power after Augustus, almost immediately he rolled back the adultery laws. And also, this law was probably very rarely enforced. Note 2, a case judged by Augustus, the author of this law, in which a man has married an adulterous woman, something clearly against his own law. Yet Augustus lets the man off the hook, and the fact that the wedding could even take place implies this woman was not banished at the time. Even in Juvenal's second satire, he's referring to this law as a rarely cited statute. Even Tacitus, writing 50 years after Augustus's death, seemed to claim that the law only enriched the imperial treasury. He even goes on to say, quote, marriages and the rearing of children did not become more frequent. So it seems like these laws were woefully ineffective. To continue his argument, Leather then cites
Pompey, Mark Antony, and Augustus, among many others, were accused of adultery.
Leather got all of these from Edwards. Let's go through these real quick. In the Pompey quote, the affairs are not really the issue at hand. The issue at hand is him neglecting the public interests. Suetonius talks about Augustus's well-known lustful tendencies and relays a letter Mark Antony wrote to Augustus, where Mark Antony openly admits to his own adulterous affairs. Leather also talks about
Clodius, via his infiltration into the Bona Dei festival, had tried to seduce the wife of Julius Caesar, for which he was castigated.
But he never actually gives a citation, so I really had to go digging for this. Here's essentially the whole story. There was a big religious festival going on, and Clodius essentially disguised himself as a woman and snuck into the festival. It does seem like it was probably to sleep with Caesar's wife. However, Clodius was not castigated for this. The specific crime he was charged with was sacrilege, or disrupting this ritual. And he was even acquitted of this. Leather then quotes
Tacitus, again in glowing terms, discusses how the Germanics dealt with adultery.
He is quoting something that I think shows the opposite of his point. Tacitus is saying here that Germans punished adulteresses harshly, and that's being portrayed in a good light. But the rest of this passage is that Rome does not do this. No one in Germany laughs at vice. Still better is the condition of those states in which only maidens are given in marriage. They receive one husband, that they may have no thoughts beyond, no further reaching desires. The fact that he's writing it out in this way and specifying no one in Germany laughs at vice implies that in Rome, these were not the morals of the time. This is, if anything, much more indicative of the morals Tacitus did not see occurring in Rome. I also must admit here, I'm not exactly sure where Leather got this from. I originally thought he got this from the Williams, because Williams does talk about this section, though he never quotes it directly. However, note that in Williams' citation, he writes it as tac germ with an M at the end, whereas Leather puts his citation as tac jur. All of the sources I've talked about this far have cited this work as tac germ with the M at the end. And note that Leather, even earlier, when he stole that bit from Richland, also included the M and the italicization the same way that Richland did it. Usually in cases like this, I can just Google his quote the exact way he does it, and I'll find where he got it from. However, in this instance, there's just a few too many results for me to really narrow it down effectively. I will say my favorite, the Perseus Library, is one of the first search results, and they also do the citation as tac-jur without the M, the same way Leather does it. Maybe Leather saw this referenced in the Williams and actually did do the work to Google it and track the quote down. And the reason he missed a lot of the context is because he didn't bother reading things on either side of that particular section. But so that I don't let Leather's bad faith rub off on me, I will at the very least give him credit for doing the work to actually go look up the work and read at least that section.
Note here too, where Leather just copied his additional quotes from the Edwards. And again, because of that weird formatting, screwed up the copying and pasting and didn't bother to fix it. He just had zero care for this at all. I guess he thought a citations document would make him look more official or something, but it just made it so easy to see how full of it he was.
Leather then gets back into talking about pederasty, starting with a mangled Seneca quote to prove that they happened, even though he, and at this point I, have provided tons of evidence that they happened. Leather then claims
these relationships, to whatever extent they did occur, were strongly criticized.
I feel like I have provided a bunch of evidence to the contrary. I'll just mention that, Virgil, when he wrote the Aeneid, again, the history of Rome, commissioned by its first emperor, included a pederastic relationship. Leather's only real evidence of this is a Cicero quote in which he is mocking Mark Antony for, when he was a boy, being in a pederastic relationship with an older man named Curio. But again, I don't think Leather really looked into this, because if you follow the quote through, Cicero seems to be claiming that Mark Antony was really into it, and even claimed that Mark Antony tried to break into Curio's father's house to have sex with Curio. I don't know how much the best invective against pederasty is the boy wanted it.
Note that in that same piece, Cicero goes on to say that he actually defended the pederastic couple, going so far as talking to the older boy's father.
So now the Leather tries to get into providing us.
And lastly, to bring up these pederastic attestations, without mentioning what I found to be the far more numerous examples of men denouncing the practice, is just plain dishonesty.
His first evidence is a Quintilian quote where he says he loves the plays of Afranius, but he wishes that Afranius didn't include so many love affairs with young boys. I think Leather didn't really read into this much because, if anything, this is saying they were really common. Afranius was an incredibly popular playwright in his time. Ausonius even mentions him, which shows that his plays were still being performed well into the late empire. We don't have all of his work surviving, obviously. We only have fragments of most of his plays, and only a few have survived completely. But really fun fact, nothing that survives of him actually includes any reference to pederasty whatsoever. Leather's next quote is,
in a court case, Cicero attempts to discredit his opponent by implying that he is in a pederastic relationship with a foreign boy. He says of him, "I know his type, his habits, his desires."
This quote is actually in reference not to the man on trial, but to a witness who is about to take the stand in the man's defense. Cicero is claiming this man will be an unreliable witness, as this man had been in a relationship with the defendant when he was younger. The defendant had also lent this man some money, which was never paid back. So lots of reasons to lie. The full context, though, is as he has not yet given his evidence, I am waiting to see what he will state, for I know the sort of man that he is. I know his habits, his licentious ways. Therefore, I will not argue against it before he has stated it, for if I do, he will alter it and invent something else. So this quote is really not even about the pederastic relationship at all. If anything, with his habits, Cicero's just saying, he lies a lot and he makes stuff up. Leather might have missed some of this context because he stole this directly from McMullen and didn't actually read the source.
I know his type, his habits, his desires, of course implying the worst.
Leather's next quote is another Cicero quote, which again, he is sort of wrongly interpreting. He claims that, he's attributing all these things and talking about how the pederastic relationship with these boys is negative, but that's very clearly not what Cicero is talking about. He's very clearly talking about how the murders and the frauds and the intimidation of witnesses, that is the bad thing this gang of youths is doing. If anything, the relationships, the pederasty, that's just how he gets the boys to his cause, is he sort of finds these boys and then kind of uses a lover boy method to get them into his cause, like a gay Andrew Tate. Leather then goes on to say,
and there are many other instances of men being condemned for this behavior. See the citation for more.
But his next citation is literally just one line before his previous one. Like, I love how often he'll just go on about like, oh, I have so many citations. There's hundreds of citations. I have thousands of citations. I have so many citations. I can't even go into them all. But then whenever you look at his citations, it's usually just like the same thing over and over again. I mean, he has cited a lot. Well, he didn't read any. I don't know. Why am I giving him credit? He didn't read any of this stuff. Never mind. Moving on. It's also really funny how you can see how he did the two citations differently, because McMullen does this weird like period comma thing. Leather then moves on to a section on
Stoicism was popular during this time period.
which is true. It was quite popular in Rome around this time.
Central to Stoic philosophy was the teaching of self-control and self-mastery, something which was considered at odds with homosexual sex.
But I have a few issues with how he presents this. Zeno, the father of Stoicism, was incredibly gay. Sadly, most of his like original written works have been lost, but we do have a few quotes from him that have survived in reference in other Stoic works. In Outline of Pyrrhonism, Sextus Empiricus claims Zeno said, quote, have carnal knowledge no more and no less of a favorite child than of a non-favorite, of a female than of a male. And in the same work by the same author states, quote, sodomy is regarded as shameful and moreover illegal, whereas by the Germani, they say it is not considered shameful, but just a customary thing. But is there anything surprising about this, when not only the followers of the Cynic philosophy, but also those of Zeno of Citium, namely Cleanthes and Chrysippus, say that this practice is indifferent? Now, if you're fact-checking me, and I hope you are, you'll notice that Sextus Empiricus just said that sodomy was shameful and illegal. However, he was writing about 500 years after most of these other men died in the late Roman Empire. I'm merely trying to push back on the idea of Leather's claim that all the Stoics were opposed to homosexuality. The founders and early leaders of the school definitely weren't. The earlier Stoics coming out of Cynicism were much more just sort of like the getting at the truth and the rejection of society and the knowledge of self, and the later Stoics were a lot more focused on that knowledge of self thing. To the point where they were sort of rejecting a lot of these cultural norms of the time and focusing more on like self-control. Leather's first quote showing the Stoics were opposed to homosexual sex is again
Musonius Rufus wrote the following
from his 12th lecture, which I feel like, again, we've kind of beaten to death at this point, so I'm just going to skip it. But again, he's really condemning all sex that's not explicitly for procreation. Leather then leaves the Stoics for some reason and turns to
the precursors to the Stoics. All generally agree that homosexuality was wrong, including Plato.
But thought-wise, the school of Platonism was very much not where Stoicism came from. Stoicism actually came more directly from Cynicism, and one of the earliest fathers of Cynicism was Diogenes. You may have heard some of these famous stories in which Diogenes and Plato clash heads, such as one of my favorites where Plato is, sitting down trying to rationalize like, oh, what is a man? And in the end he says, well, a man is a featherless biped. And so Diogenes runs into the room with a plucked chicken and slams it on the table and goes, behold, a man. The Cynics butted heads a lot with the Platonists. And in fact, Zeno actually wrote a book called The Republic, which was supposedly a direct response to Plato's Republic, critiquing a lot of the things Plato brought up in that. However, sadly, that work is lost. Leather lastly references a Seneca quote, who was a Roman Stoic, so good job on this one. He quotes it as,
it is something to be ashamed of if there is a slave in your following of boys whose healthy complexion needs no cosmetics. Else the more stylish folk around you may say in disbelief, have you no girl favorite, no boy to rouse her envy? These are the voices of, quote, everyone that you must flee.
Note Leather's quotation marks too. Why the extra set before the word have? Because he stole this directly from McMullen and didn't realize that McMullen had interrupted the quote in the middle with his own sentence. Fun fact, if you Google girl favorite and boy to rouse, you only get this. The rest of the line after no cosmetics is just to avoid conversing with these people. Nothing about girl favorites or boys to rouse their envy. That comes in a later section, in a list of activities one might pursue if they put pleasure above all else. Yet in other works, like in Seneca's On a Happy Life, he makes very clear pleasures are not to be avoided or discarded. They definitionally make life more pleasurable. He only points out one should not pursue or become attached to these things. So really the thing to avoid is caring so much about appearances that you actually put makeup on your own slaves, which is in keeping with the rest of the letter's theme about not living to excess and not feeling like you have to keep up with the Joneses. In addition, Leather's idea that just because a certain school of philosophy came before a different school of philosophy means it was a precursor to that school really shows his knowledge about the subject.
And now we get to the fun part of the video. We're going to start talking about historical figures, specifically the emperors, and see how gay they were. I even made up a little chart so we can sort the emperor's bisexuality. First up is Gaius Julius himself. Not an emperor, as Leather himself says, but he wants to start here. That's fine.
He stayed at the court of King Nicomedes, whom he petitioned to aid in raising a fleet for Rome. And he was successful in this, by the way. Unfortunately for Caesar, he stayed longer than was absolutely necessary at Nicomedes' court, and rumors began to spread that maybe he was sexually involved with the king.
For a lot of the emperors, Leather just ends up stealing from websites. My guess is he just Googled it and clicked on the first website that popped up. This one, for example, he stole mostly from one website, and that website barely cited anything.
This despite the fact that there are a myriad of other explanations for his staying. He could have been shoring up political alliances. He could have been avoiding a return trip to Rome, or he simply could have enjoyed living at a king's court. According to Cassius Dio, Caesar always violently denied these accusations, despite the fact that he was also reportedly fine with people mocking him in any other regard.
Now, Leather is doing a trick here, or to be generous, maybe he just didn't read the website he stole this from closely enough. The account of Caesar pushing back on the accusations he had been with Nicomedes comes entirely from Cassius Dio, who was writing about 250 years after Caesar died. However, the account of Caesar being okay with all the insults is coming from Suetonius's account of the life of Caesar, which was written about 150 years after Caesar's death. So he's kind of putting these two different sources together into a single source to paint a picture that neither of the underlying sources really paint. Dio does sort of mention that Caesar was okay with other insults, but it's not so much that he's fine with them so much as he accepts them. For example, when the crowd yells at him, you better stay in power or you're going to jail, Caesar kind of smiles and says like, well, at least we all know where we stand. For Suetonius, though, when we hear about all the insults about Nicomedes, we never actually get to hear how Caesar feels about them. We do, however, have another interesting moment from Suetonius, where Caesar, after a string of victories, makes the comment that he's going to mount his enemies' heads. And a random person in the crowd kind of says, oh, that'd be difficult for any woman even, sort of imputing a double entendre. However, Caesar replies to it very calmly that there were queens in ancient times who ruled over much of Asia, sort of implying that he's okay with the insult in this instance, or at least is fine enough with it to sort of give it back rather than violently protesting. Leather then goes on to say,
and not once for the rest of his life was he accused of any homosexual escapades.
Again, Leather did not look into this at all. Catullus also accused Caesar of being gay, and not with Nicomedes, but one of his officers. Catullus even goes on to claim that Caesar was a Pathic, even outside of his accusation of him topping his officer. He then goes on to say,
because this rumor was repeated so often, it really says something about how the Romans viewed passive homosexuality. They must have detested it.
Regardless of whether or not it was true, it did seem to be a pretty common idea at the time. His own troops even said, Caesar has conquered Gaul, where Nicomedes has conquered Caesar. This didn't really seem to affect his political career at all, or any of his aspirations. He still recruited troops, he still raised money, he still, went on campaigns and won wars. He still had an incredibly successful political career despite being labeled a homosexual passive, which, if anything, I'd say kind of flies in the face of what Leather's argument has been for most of this video. Also, very funny. I didn't really bother going into Leather's sources here, but note how he cites at one point Suet Jewel versus Suet Seas. These are both Suetonius, the Life of Julius Caesar. So they were both from different articles, and he just never read or checked them. So he just, put those citations in like that. So for Caesar, I'm going to say maybe. From what we've covered up until now, it certainly would have been weird, but I feel a bit strange imputing sexualities to historical figures when all we have are rumors.
I have thoughts on Elagabalus for the same reasons, but I digress.
Next, Leather moves on to the great princeps Augustus. Leather starts by saying
he was rumored to have been very sexually promiscuous, having had affairs with many married women.
Now, Leather claims
these accusations, however, came in large part from Mark Antony.
To be fair, he did write one letter to Augustus accusing him of that, But we have plenty of other accusations from Dio, Suetonius, and even Tacitus. And many of these instances of supposed adultery took place well after Mark Antony had died.
There's also much made of a passing mention to a slave boy named Sarmentus, and that this slave was a deliciae, meaning a plaything.
In this specific story, Mark Antony and his friends are drinking wine from Cleopatra, and one of the friends basically says, this wine is sour, whereas, even Augustus' slave boys are drinking sweet wine right now, and Cleopatra gets very angry. Now, Leather claims...
Some scholars, like Amy Richland, believe that, again, this was a rumor spread by Mark Antony and his followers in order to hurt Augustus. And I find this to be pretty reasonable given the other rumors they attempted to spread about the man.
However, I think, again, he didn't read the Richland closely. Now, I'm pretty sure he's referencing her book On the Gardens of Priapus, which is one of her first books that came out about Roman sexuality. On page 91, after listing a bunch of debaucherous acts that Suetonius claimed emperors engaged in, she asks how much we can trust. While it's purported that he had more access than anyone else to the imperial archives, Richland sort of makes the argument that Suetonius was trying to tell a story and was trying to write it for an audience, and so would very naturally, put certain things as kind of comparisons to each other. So Suetonius would say Domitian was a Pathic, and then also say in the same breath that he passed legislation to kind of cut down on Pathics. However, the part about Sarmentus, notably, doesn't actually come from Suetonius. It actually comes from Plutarch. The quote we have from Plutarch is attributed to Dellius, who Plutarch calls a historian in his own right, and he was also Mark Antony's friend. The latter part, clarifying who Sarmentus was, actually comes from Plutarch himself, however. Richland's entire point is we can't necessarily trust invectives that historians claim come from letters, whereas this specific instance of Sarmentus is Plutarch clarifying who Sarmentus was, referencing another historian who likely wrote about that specific scene taking place. I'm honestly not sure how Leather missed... Oh, wait. This is just from the Williams footnote. He didn't actually read the Richland. Okay, never mind. Moving on.
The only other reference I found to Augustus being a pederast was a seemingly untrustworthy piece of gossip, which said that he slept with a dozen catamites in his bed.
I think he means he could only find one other quote in that footnote. Regardless, there's Dio 48-42, in which Augustus has naked boys at his second wedding. Suetonius Augustus 83, where he likes to play games with little boys and even searched everywhere for the most beautiful to collect them. Note, this was well after the Civil War, so no Antony here. Leather then goes on to say that
if you do choose to believe Suetonius and Mark Antony and his friend, then it would have to be with the knowledge that this would make Augustus a supreme hypocrite.
If you do think that, you're in the company of three of the major historians who wrote about him, Suetonius, Dio, and Tacitus. Tacitus, though pretty much all of his history takes place after the death of Augustus, does start with his funeral, where a few men there notably say, filial duty and the critical position of the state had been used merely as a cloak. Come to facts. Dio claims that Augustus was reluctant to introduce additional moral reforms and was badgered into it by senators making, quote, ironical allusions to his own intimacy with many women. When he says this is as far as he can go and the men should just learn to control their wives, they all start saying like, well, how do you control your wife? To which he gives an answer where, quote, his actions did not lend credence to his words. So Augustus goes in the gay column. Likely into little boys, definitely a hypocrite. Leather next moves on to the second emperor and the first to actually solidify the role, Tiberius. Leather references Suetonius' quote,
he trained little boys, whom he termed tiddlers, to crawl between his thighs when he went swimming.
Leather calls this gross and goes on to say that most Romans probably wouldn't have been in favor of this, which I agree. Romans weren't really into toddlers. However, he then goes on to say that
Tacitus and Dio make no mention of this behavior.
And then he even goes on to say that
Tacitus is generally considered either neutral or negative towards Tiberius,
which was really confusing to me. So I did a little Googling.
It seems like Leather mostly got everything on Tiberius from this website, and I can find that phrase and several other phrases Leather's about to say appearing in this article, the author of which either did no research or lied.
To be clear, Dio does allude to this, though not directly. Talking about a later emperor, Vitellius, Dio says he had been a favorite of Tiberius and was living a life in keeping with that licentious beginning. Given the time period, Vitellius would have been quite young when Tiberius retired to Capri, around age 9, and he would have been about 20 when Tiberius died. Tacitus also mentions
Tiberius had polluted with his lecheries the children of freeborn parents, going on to state he would try to buy boys, and that not working, he would have his buyers resort to threats.
Dio also claims, quote, "But the sensual orgies which he carried on shamelessly with persons of the highest rank, both male and female, brought him ill repute." So again,
Tacitus and Dio make no mention of this behavior.
Leather did not look into this at all.
Tiberius pretty safely goes into the gay column.
Now we get to the greatest artist to ever live, Nero. Leather does concede that he was likely gay, or at least bi.
He later married another man named Sporus, whom he had castrated.
And
his quote-unquote husband, Sporus, was going to be thrown into a gladiator show, but he opted to kill himself instead at the age of 20.
However, as I've already alluded to up until this point, Sporus is actually a really interesting case. After Nero, he got married 2 more times. Once to Sabinius, who did outright marry the guy at least, who was the Praetorian Guard who actually kind of argued that we should try and get Nero killed. And Sabinius would even constantly refer to Sporus as Poppaea, which was the name of Nero's second wife, who Sporus was said to look like. After Sabinius was murdered by his compatriots, Sporus then took up residence with Otho, likely engaging in some sort of concubinage with him. Otho was the second in the year of the 4 emperors and was installed by a legion that was actually appointed by Nero himself. His reign, which was rather short, just about 3 months, notably saw a lot of statues of Nero being put back up and a lot of Nero's appointees being put back into their positions. The crowds apparently loved him and would even hail him as Nero Otho. Leather already claimed that Sporus eventually took his own life. However, he skips over a lot of this guy's really cool life, where again, he was almost held up as like the key to the throne, so to speak. Not to mention his very clear popularity with the Roman populace at the time. I honestly might do a video on Nero after this. I learned so much while researching him. Originally, I sort of had the idea that everyone else did, that he kind of was this crazy dude who did whatever he wanted and was sort of deposed as a result of that. But with a lot more research, I've actually started to wonder if it wasn't like all a big hit piece. Briefly, so as not to like super derail this video, after Nero's death, 3 different people actually rose up from around the empire and claimed to be Nero and were successful enough to get at least small armies under them, although none of them really ever went far. Suetonius also tells us that some people actually laid flowers at the grave of Nero for years after his death. And of the 4 emperors who tried to take power in the year of 4 emperors, 2 tried to directly associate themselves with Nero in order to gain popular legitimacy. But back to Leather. He then claims...
Also remember that Nero was deposed in 68 AD, driven out of Rome by an angry mob, tried and found guilty in absentia, and sentenced to death.
Which is not at all true. Nero was facing a rebellion in the northern part of the empire over the very high taxes he had imposed. A lot of senators sort of saw this as like, oh, this could be a civil war, and they all withdrew their support from Nero. At this time, Nero actually just left the city on his own. There was no angry mob chasing him out at all. When people found out that the Senate had declared him an enemy of the people, people did go chase after him. So Nero chose to self-delete, though not without, according to Suetonius at least, a bunch of drama. But here's the really interesting part. We have 3 main records for the history of Nero: Dio, Suetonius, and Tacitus. Now, Dio claims everyone celebrated his death, and Suetonius, as we mentioned earlier, claimed most people did, but some still put flowers on his grave. Tacitus, however, paints a really interesting picture. He claims that senators, equestrians, and the respectable citizens, or those not wealthy enough to be in the upper classes but not poor enough to be plebeians, were similarly happy. However, the plebeians, who Tacitus had a disdain for, were incredibly sad and kept looking for rumors that Nero might return. Keep in mind, the plebeians made up about 80% of the city of Rome at this time. I think this paints a really interesting picture of what the life of Nero may have actually been, and that it's possible he was much more of a champion of the people who was just hated by the elites.
Nero goes firmly in the gay column.
Leather then goes on to Galba, the next emperor after Nero. He's not going to mention Otho, by the way. He also fails to mention the man Suetonius claimed Galba was most in love with, named Icelus, or Icelus, or Icelus. I don't know. He's dead. I don't care. I'm saying his name wrong. Leather merely quotes Suetonius saying, quote,
"He was more inclined to unnatural desire, and in gratifying it preferred full-grown men." Again, a man being censured for his homosexual preferences.
Now, in his footnote, Leather does actually mention the thing that I was going to say, which is that the word unnatural does not actually appear in the Latin at all. The original Latin much more closely translates to just, he was more inclined towards men. A lot of times these artifacts would be for older translations of these works, would kind of see something like that and be like, oh, I'm going to translate that as unnatural because saying, he was into men might be shocking for people to read. We've sort of gone over this up to this point, but it just bears repeating in this instance. Leather stole almost all of this from Galba in the Bedroom. This exact analysis, almost word for word, comes from that piece. However, I still disagree with the framing, regardless of who was saying it. So he claims that Suetonius always uses libido in a negative sense, but thanks to the Perseus Library again, we can actually check this pretty easily. We get 20 instances, removing the Galba one, and another one that I couldn't really determine one way or the other. We're at 18. Put my exact findings in the companion doc. If you don't really care about that, the final count is 12 negative, 6 positive. Now, personally, I don't think the Galba thing is negative because Suetonius uses literally this exact wording when referring to Julius Caesar. Oh, obviously referring to him being attracted to women, not men. Incidentally, the one I couldn't score was Claudius, in which he says he was lustful for women, but not for men. So if you kind of want to say that he's being negative here, then you also have to assume that he's being negative for Claudius.
Galba, very gay, likely not even bi.
Leather then says one single sentence that originally was the impetus for this entire video.
Next, Elagabalus. He's an unimportant emperor historically.
To say Elagabalus was an unimportant emperor historically is insane. I wanted to get into this more, and honestly, maybe I'll just do an entire video on this guy, but Elagabalus pushed through a bunch of fantastical religious reforms that, in my opinion, basically paved the way for the birth of Christianity. Now, I'm going to warn you before I get into this. This is a crackpot theory incoming, so do not take what I'm about to say as gospel, but I believe this so wholeheartedly, and I will debate or fight literally anyone who wants to fight me on this. Elagabalus was the head priest of the cult of Elgabal, a sun deity that was worshipped mostly in Syria at the time, although he did have a small temple in the city of Rome itself. Briefly, Roman polytheism was a little different from how we might think of polytheism today. Essentially, they viewed that as gods were in the realm of the divine, no one person could truly fully understand and grasp any particular god. So when they went to foreign lands and found these other gods, they would assume that those foreign gods were just kind of a different aspect or a different presentation of a god that they already knew. So if they go to Egypt, for example, and see Ra, they think, that must be just like our god Helios. It's probably just a different form. And sometimes they would even take these foreign gods and take them back into Rome and directly incorporate them into their pantheon. Famously, the cult of Isis actually maintained enormous popularity in Rome right up until the Christianization of the empire. If you ever wondered why Zeus and Jupiter and all these gods are kind of two different names for the same thing, this is essentially why. Part of what allowed Rome to control such a large area with such diverse peoples within it was that you essentially were allowed to worship in whatever way you wanted, providing you still burned offerings to Jupiter, and at certain times under the empire, the cult of the emperors as well. Back to Elagabalus. He popularized in the city of Rome the worship of this one deity called Sol Invictus, or the invincible sun, or unconquerable sun, or whatever positive adjective you want to throw out there. Now, at the time, Elagabalus did this by incorporating Sol Invictus into the Roman pantheon above Jupiter, even trying to marry Sol Invictus to some of Jupiter's kids and establishing a very large temple called the Temple of Elagabalus, because again, Elgabal and Sol Invictus. Anyway, now, at the time, this was not super well taken by the upper classes. However, nearly 100 years later, when the crisis of the 3rd century finally resolved with Aurelian coming to power and restoring the empire, he immediately went to the Temple of Elgabal and prayed to Sol Invictus, and actually turned Sol Invictus into the kind of main deity of the empire. However, the story doesn't end there. Before Constantine became debatably Christian, he associated himself with Sol Invictus as his patron deity. Note some of these coins from pretty early in his reign. Note specifically some of these light rays or majesties coming out of Sol Invictus. They eventually did make their way into Christian iconography. Even to spread Christianity throughout the empire, Jesus was originally just introduced into the Roman pantheon, right alongside gods like Jupiter and Sol Invictus. And then a lot of effort was put into converting the rural population of Rome, which were primarily sun worshippers. Compare this even to the conversion of Mesoamerica, where you had these groups of people who, as part of their religious practices, included bloodletting or even blood sacrifice. And then when you come there and say, oh, hey, we have a deity who gave his blood for your sins, that makes a lot of sense.
Again, this is my crackpot theory. You can check the companion doc, but I am not going to have a lot of sources for this because this is just kind of me pulling at some threads that make sense to me. So maybe read about some other people who disagree with me, but I will fight anyone.
Anyway, sorry for the tangent. Back into Leather. So his point on Elagabalus is...
But he's remembered mostly today for being a sexual degenerate. By the time Elagabalus was 18, the Praetorian Guard had decided to kill him.
But Elagabalus wasn't deposed because he was gay. In actuality, he was deposed more because of his blasphemy. That's essentially what was worrying everyone. Taking this, what most of the Roman elites saw as a foreign god, and putting it above, their native Jupiter, was really worrying to the Romans. The Romans viewed that much of their success and their empire and their military might came because they were favored by the gods. And the reason they believed they were favored by the gods was because they were performing these rituals accurately. In fact, a lot of the Roman religion centered around sort of making deals with the gods. With Elagabalus, they were very worried that they were essentially going to bring the ire of the gods down upon them for this kind of blasphemy. At the time, they were pushing Elagabalus to actually kind of keep doing his cult stuff in secret and then put his brother more on the throne. And Elagabalus just kept trying to have his brother murdered. So the Praetorian Guard kind of said, well, we can't risk one of these plots actually working, so we'll just take matters into our own hands. However, many of Elagabalus's court appointees also took husbands. It was sort of an imperial fashion statement at the time. And Elagabalus reigned for 4 years. So it feels a little weird that the Praetorian Guard would see this guy being so gay and be like, well, how about we just slowly take care of things? And then eventually they're just like, nope, 3 years of being gay was fine, but 4 is too much. Leather then goes on to say,
the selection of emperors so far might have you thinking that they all behaved this way, but in fact, most were far more chaste and or decidedly not attracted to men or boys.
I kind of want to take a look at all the emperors up to this point and see how many of them have either accusations or outright confirmed were gay. Leather might argue that some of these are just accusations, but I'll take the Williams, and I guess now my argument, that the fact that all these arguments were sort of believed at the time, or at least were in rumor circulating, sort of showed what the Romans thought about their emperors. I'll post the full list behind me and in the companion doc as well with citations, but the full count since Augustus, so not including Caesar, are 10.5 gay, 2.5 straight, with Nerva getting a half point because we have one accusation of him, but it's from Suetonius and it's clearly to malign Emperor Domitian, so I don't really know how much we can trust it. Now, the main reason I think this is relevant is because if you were to go to some random kingdom and, someone in that kingdom was supposed to be, oh, this kingdom really hates gay people. And you were like, yeah. And you were like, yeah, they got laws against it and they have court cases about it. And boy, they just hate gay people. And you're like, so how many kings have they had? And they're like, oh, they've had 14 kings. And it's like, oh, and how many were gay? And they're like, 10.
In addition, some of these emperors even seized power through civil war, which means not only were they military veterans, but they were popular enough to have troops willing to fight and die for them. So if they were like being despised because of their sexuality, while also having troops fight and die for them, I don't know, that's on you to explain that.
Now we're going to move on to the poster boys of gay love in ancient Rome, Emperor Hadrian and his lover Antinius. Very quickly, for those who aren't familiar, Hadrian first met Antinius when he visited Greece, and Antinius later would follow him back to Rome. Years later, Hadrian would do a tour of the empire where Antinius would accompany him, going from Greece and then eventually making his way down to Egypt. There, for some reason we still don't know, Antinius fell into the Nile and drowned. Hadrian was so distraught by this that he had a bunch of works commissioned for him and statues, and later saw a star in the sky, which an astrologer told him was, proof that Antinius had been deified. And then Hadrian basically formed the cult of Antinius and went around spreading it all over the empire.
So was Hadrian gay? And is this perhaps the first example of an emperor who was openly gay and not censured for it?
To briefly explain what I just threw up over Leather's video, Trajan was a very beloved emperor. He was so beloved that he was actually given the title Optimus Princeps, or Best Emperor. Now, according to Dio, the closest we have to a contemporary historian, Trajan was also gay. But Dio goes out of his way to point out that in his relations with boys, he harmed no one. So no one really seemed upset with any of his actions. Notably, Trajan was the emperor right before Hadrian. So Leather asking this sort of silly rhetorical question of,
and is this perhaps the first example of an emperor who was openly gay and not censured for it?
Shows how little research he's done. Because if he cracked open a single one of Dio's books, he would have really quickly seen that the one right before Hadrian was gay and not censured for it.
Well, despite what the dozens of pro-gay articles on Google will tell you, we don't really know.
He mainly points out that we only have one real source for what happened at the time, that being the source of Cassius Dio. He'll mention we do have other sources.
So where do these claims come from? Well, they may have stemmed in large part from much later writings, but there are two things to note about these rumors. One, Hadrian died in 138 AD. So these come more than 200 years after his death. And two, the authors state clearly that these rumors are scandalous, meaning that, again, even if they were true, it would not have been approved of.
Briefly, these quotes which Leather put up, he's dismissing because they were written 250 to 300 years after the death of Hadrian. However, earlier, he was fine using Dio's account of Julius Caesar denying that he was Pathic with Nicomedes, who was also writing about 250 years after the death of Caesar. So a little inconsistent from Leather here, but who am I kidding? He wasn't even thinking about that in the first place. The second quote actually not only does not say the rumors were scandalous, but actually points out that Hadrian was gay even outside of Antinous. So, Leather wants to ignore him because they're written too late or whatever. And again, I'm trying to meet him where he is, so fine. But I'll put my thoughts to them in the companion doc.
But let's get into the Dio quote. Antinous was from Bithynium, a city of Bithynia, which we also call Claudiopolis. He had been a favorite of the emperor and had died in Egypt, either by falling into the Nile, as Hadrian writes, or, as the truth is, by being offered in sacrifice. For Hadrian, as I have stated, was always very curious and employed divinations and incantations of all kinds. Accordingly, he honored Antinous, either because of his love for him or because the youth had voluntarily undertaken to die, it being necessary that a life should be surrendered freely for the accomplishment of the ends Hadrian had in view, by building a city on the spot where he had suffered this fate and naming it after him. And he also set up statues, or rather sacred images of him, practically all over the world. Finally, he declared that he had seen a star, which he took to be that of Antinous, and gladly lent an ear to the fictitious tales woven by his associates to the effect that the star had really come into being from the spirit of Antinous and had then appeared for the first time. On this account, then, he became the object of some ridicule, and also because of the death of his sister Paulina, he had not immediately paid her any honor.
So Leather's main argument here is,
so was Hadrian gay? Well, despite what the dozens of pro-gay articles on Google will tell you, we don't really know. According to Dio, Antinous didn't simply die, but rather was killed. Realistically, there was nothing which definitively suggests that Hadrian was a homosexual.
Dio wrote in Greek, and the Greeks, God bless them, have like 1 billion words for love, differentiating different types of love. That point in the quote where Dio says, either out of love for the boy, the word love is erota, the Greek word for erotic love.
Note there's even an earlier passage where Dio uses this exact same word to imply that Hadrian only got his power because Trajan's wife was into him. Note that Dio really didn't like how Hadrian came to power, although he does sort of begrudgingly at least accept that Hadrian did have a pretty good reign.
In addition, as part of the quote where Dio says, either because of his love for him or because the youth had undertaken it to die, these are given as the only two options for why Hadrian erected the city. Yet earlier, all we had from Hadrian's account was just that he fell into the river. Nothing about love, erotic or otherwise. So Dio using the word erota here is a new piece of information. This would imply that even if the human sacrifice angle was true, there was still some errata shared between the two that Dio knew about and was referencing. I want to point out one other thing about this quote. Dio notably states, as Hadrian writes. So Hadrian's version of events was essentially that he drowns in the river, and Dio's version of the events is that Antinous is sacrificed to complete some big ritual. It seems a little weird to kind of concoct this world where Hadrian's like going around building this cult, and everyone's like, oh, why is this guy so important? And Hadrian just kind of looks around and he's like, oh, he fell into a river. And everyone's like, oh, why did he get deified? And Hadrian's just like, drowning? I don't know. But that's just the Dio quote. We actually do have more contemporary evidence about his relationship. Prior to Hadrian's arrival in Egypt, he actually went on several hunting trips with Antinous, where they hunted, very notably, a lion and a boar. This was all actually commissioned into tondos that were later put into the Arch of Constantine that can still be seen in the city of Rome to this day. I bring this up because it shows there was some level of favoritism towards this freeman that was shown before his death. He's in almost every tondo with the emperor. Keep in mind, these would have been commissioned and completed before the supposed human sacrifice. Their boar hunt is also attributed to in poems Hadrian had commissioned by the poet Pancrates. Now, sadly, they are incredibly fragmented, but we do have some really interesting moments where it's just the two of them on the hunt. Antinous is described as lovely Antinous, and Hadrian, when he has the opportunity to kill the boar, merely wounds it, wanting to see how straight the other aims. Something else Leather neglected to mention is we have even another contemporary source, Pausanias' description of Greece. This was a book that Pausanias wrote just traveling Greece, and it's sort of just, a travel guide. It was written in the mid-2nd century, so just after Hadrian had passed, and actually goes through the town where the cult of Antinous was centered at the time. We honestly don't get much here, but it does say that Antinous was a great favorite of Hadrian. Now, I'd love to sit here and say that this was always a term used for a sexual favorite or someone was in love with, and while it was a lot of times used for that, it was also used for other things. There's examples of kings talking about having a great favorite of a stag or a great favorite of a horse that they like riding. So while it could mean this, because obviously you could have a great favorite woman or a great favorite boy or things like this, it didn't necessarily mean that. Now, before we leave the emperors, I want to take a brief look at one emperor who came to after Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius. Now, Leather's actually aware of Marcus Aurelius. He referenced him earlier in that,
as mentioned at the start of the video, both Antoninus Pius and his adoptive son, Marcus Aurelius, were both extremely chaste.
In his earlier mention, he talked about
Marcus Aurelius seemed to condemn all such activity too, and wrote in his famous Meditations that Antoninus Pius taught him to, quote, suppress all passion for young men, implying that this was obviously a good thing.
However, we have uncovered letters between Marcus Aurelius and his tutor Fronto, in which Marcus Aurelius seems eager to please, shall we say. To scratch the surface, Marcus Aurelius writes to his tutor when Marcus Aurelius was 19 and his tutor was somewhere in his 40s, the following. Farewell, breath of my life. Should I not burn with love of you, who have written to me as you have? What shall I do? I cannot cease. Last year it befell me in this very place, and at this very time, to be consumed with a passionate longing for my mother. This year you inflame my longing. As well as a few years later, for I am in love, and this, if nothing else, ought, I think, verily to be allowed to lovers, that they should have greater joy in the triumph of their loved ones. Ours, then, is the triumph. Ours, I say. With Fronto responding with things like, whenever with soft slumbers chains around me, as the poet says, I see you in my dreams, there is never a time but I embrace and kiss you. Then, according to the tenor of each dream, I either weep copiously, or am transported with some great joy and pleasure, as well as, wherefore, even if there is any adequate reason for your love for me, I beseech you, Caesar, let us take diligent pains to conceal and ignore it. Let men doubt, discuss, dispute, guess, puzzle over the origin of our love, as over the fountains of the Nile. Just to name a few. You can check the companion doc for more. However, for right now, I want to focus on one specific exchange of letters between Fronto and Marcus Aurelius, in which Fronto has written a treatise on love, heavily inspired by the Socratic dialogue Phaedrus. Now, in Phaedrus, there is a conversation happening between Socrates and his friend Phaedrus, in which they are discussing love, and this is all brought about because Phaedrus heard a philosopher whose name, if I don't screw up the pronunciation, is Lysias. The main argument was whether you should choose a lover or a non-lover, especially in some sort of mentorship role. This was more focused on pederasty than necessarily anything involving either two adult men or a woman. And the end kind of conclusion seems to be that picking a non-lover is better than a lover, as a lover will always try and mold you into the object that will give them the most pleasure, whereas a non-lover will try and shape you into something that is the best for you, or is the greatest good, however you want to say it. Fronto, in his letter to Marcus, is essentially making the same argument. Fronto asks Marcus for his thoughts, and he replies with, "Go on then, threaten me as much as you please, and attack me with hosts of arguments. Yet shall you never drive your lover, I mean me, away. Nor shall I the less assert that I love Fronto, or love him the less, because you prove with reasons so various and so vehement that those who are less in love must be more helped and indulged." The word for lover there is erastes, or the older or top in a pederastic relationship. So interesting that Marcus is choosing sort of the top position with Fronto. Given that Fronto's argument was to not pick your lover, and Marcus Aurelius is replying with, "Well, too bad, I don't care what you say, I'm choosing Fronto," sort of implies that Fronto falls squarely into the lover category. There is a bit of scholarly debate around these letters, as opposed to whether they are outright sexual or just romantic. And I'll link an interesting article by someone whose name, if I'm not butchering, is Tauka, who I think gives both sides in a fairly reasonable way, though they do, in the end, sort of coming away with a more homoerotic reading of these letters. I'll say, just to wrap this up, that Amy Richlin, one of Leather's favorites, actually did a translation of these letters and named it Marcus Aurelius in Love, and she very clearly reads homoeroticism into these letters. The main person who seems to kind of disagree with her, his name is Chris Lays, and his argument seems to center more around, we don't necessarily know what could be sexual and what's not. Kissing in certain ways might be sexual and kissing in other ways might not be. And that, saying I burn with passion for you and you've inflamed my longing and, I can't wait to kiss your neck. It's just bros being bros. So, read for yourself. Also interesting to note, and this time I'm stealing actually from Tauka, so go me. Their letters actually do get a lot more formal and a lot less kind of this playful, whimsical stuff like a lot of the quotes I just read you. So it's possible that their relationship even changed as Marcus Aurelius went from being, what the Romans would consider a boy into something closer to a man. Leather winds down by stealing William's retelling of Livy's retelling of the Bacchanalian cult, a story from the mid-Republic.
A cult to the god Bacchus devolves into wanton immorality, both sexual and non-sexual.
Very, very briefly, because I'm sure this video is already way too long at this point, and I'm probably just going to cut this because it doesn't really matter. But the story is of a cult that was growing in Rome very rapidly at the time, and supposedly this cult was behind a lot of very prominent murders and large-scale frauds that had happened. Their regular cult rituals consisted of essentially drinking and staying up very late and engaging in orgies, and the initiation ritual involved playing the passive role to the initiating member. Eventually, the Senate takes action and executes a bunch of the prominent members of the cult, and then places the cult directly under senatorial control, which essentially just means that they're limiting the number of people who can meet at one time.
One of the first things the senators do is they say, quote, in the first place, then, women formed the great majority, and this was the source of all the mischief, which I just find very funny, that there's this cult that's like murdering people and doing debaucherous sex, and they're staying up all night drinking, and the senators just shake their head, and they're just like, women.
Leather himself even admits that homosexuality is a very small and unimportant part of this story. However, I still want to look at one quote that Leather seems to fixate on because, again, I'm just kind of researching out of spite at this point.
If you knew at what ages males were initiated, you would feel not only pity for them, but also shame. Do you think, citizens, that youths initiated by this oath should be made soldiers? That arms should be entrusted to men mustered from this foul shrine? Will men debased by their own debauchery and that of others fight to the death on behalf of the chastity of your wives and children? Yet it would be less serious if their wrongdoing had merely made them effeminate. That was in great measure their personal dishonor, and if they had kept their hands from crime and their thoughts from evil designs. Never has there been so much evil in the state, nor affecting so many people in so many ways. Whatever villainy there has been in recent years due to lust, whatever to fraud, whatever to crime, I tell you, has arisen from this one cult.
Now, Leather breaks this up into two sections, ending the first here.
First, the consul says that the age of the initiates is troubling, and yet it was told by Hispala that only men under the age of 20 were ever initiated, this being well within the range of supposed accepted pederastic relationships. Also, the line, "will men debased by their own debauchery and that of others," seems to suggest that these men were not only penetrated, but also penetrated others. No distinction is made, which indicates that the active partner is not to be blamed.
However, when you put these quotes together, you get a very different picture. This shows the issue isn't gay sex. It's their lack of self-control, their drinking and late-night partying, and how these men, getting so unused to the rigors and strictness of being a Roman soldier so early, would then be very poor soldiers when it was time for them to sign up for the army.
If these men had merely been sexually violated, had merely been made effeminatus, that would be one thing. But because he explicitly calls out sexual crimes by mentioning villainy due to lust, and he has already absolved the passive homosexuals as less blameworthy, we can again assume that he is censuring the active homosexuals in this case.
However, the word lust here has been used to refer to many things, not just sexual, such as when Caesar did things according to his lust for power. Even Livy uses this exact same term to refer to people taking land due to their lusts. And again, given that most of the focus on these crimes seem to be on the fact that they're going around murdering people and committing frauds and stuff like that, I really don't think the sexual aspect of these crimes seems to be the main focus. And now we're on to the final point of the video. If you have made it this far, you are a real trooper. Leather's final point is about the Pompeian graffiti. Now, firstly, he says that
most are incomplete fragments or just total nonsense. The complete sentences that we have are mostly non-sexual, of course.
This is not true. And it's funny because he would have been right if he wasn't so specific. The most common form of graffiti that we have are random scratches or pictures or just like individual letters. And this makes sense because, as we know, most Romans weren't literate. The most common of like full words, though, is just names or so-and-so was here, which also makes sense because in an illiterate population, you'd probably at least know how to write your own name. However, among like full sentences and complete phrases, the most common are those related to sex and love, more often than not love poetry, either original compositions or far more commonly just quoting poets like Ovid and Virgil and people like that. The graffiti in the Lupanar, the first brothel uncovered in Pompeii, has about 50% of the graffiti on there as names, with 30% being sexual or explicit in nature, which according to Sarah Levine Richardson, that seems to mirror the pattern of graffiti in the city at large.
However, I actually do want to compliment Leather on his analysis of the first two graffitis he brings up. I actually think they're pretty good. His first is
Amplicatus. I know that Icarus is buggering you. Salvius wrote this.
Now, he points out, why would you sign it like this? And maybe it's sort of a joke on Amplicatus and Salvius at the same time, essentially, you know, just someone sort of playing a prank on their two other soldier friends. And honestly, this is a pretty good interpretation. We'll never know, of course, but, you know, honestly, he even moved the needle with me on that one. His next one,
I have buggered men,
is also a pretty good analysis. He points out it's just written on someone's house, the house of Orpheus to be exact. He says it might just be a prank on that guy, and that's a pretty good analysis. This one didn't convince me as much because there's so much graffiti on those walls. It feels a little silly that someone would just graffiti that, you know, next to a bunch of other graffiti and have people read it and then be like, oh my God, he's saying that the guy who owned that house is gay, but I don't know, who knows. Either way, it's not the worst analysis I've heard. It feels pretty genuine, at least. The third one, which is,
weep, you girls, my penis has given you up. Now it penetrates men's behinds. Goodbye, wondrous femininity.
Was a bit more disappointing. He admits it is gay, but then just says,
so many of these messages are meant to be satirical. I don't know if it's wise to take this one seriously.
The issue here is tons of the rest of the graffiti is non-satirical. There's, of course, the famous, today I made bread, which I mean is just, that's just true. There's even another I love of a man lusting after a mule driver, where he says, quote, if you felt the fires of love, mule driver, you would make more haste to see Venus. I love a charming boy. I ask you, goad the mules. Let's go. Take me to Pompeii where love is sweet. You are mine. With that, Leather pithily claims he's just pushing back against scholarship that he believes has gone too far and ends the video. Again, as I think I've shown, he is very much not doing that. And if anything, from my view, I don't know that scholarship has pushed far back enough yet. If you made it this far,
Thank you. I don't know why. I'm glad you enjoyed it, really, to make it this far. This is basically just me getting like mad at someone on the internet and just giving up like a month of my life to just research ancient gay sex. So if you made it this far, honestly, just leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought about the video. Let me know what I could do to make it better, or really anything else you want to look for. Any questions about Roman history? I know quite a lot. I'll be sure to answer anything that I find in the comments, but yeah, don't really know how to end YouTube videos. Like, do I just cut to black?